Hi guys. Tonight we are stepping straight into the gloom of a medieval castle cell, where the walls seem to breathe coldness into your bones. Imagine walking into that echoing chamber for the very first time. The torches sputter, their smoke crawling up the damp stonework, and the heavy iron door slams shut behind you. The air itself feels sharp, like it has teeth. You know instantly this is no place meant for human comfort. You take a breath, and the smell of mildew and wet limestone clings to your nostrils like a punishment. If you were hoping for a welcome mat, think again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Your journey begins. You lower yourself to the floor, and the chill races up through your legs, into your spine, as if the stone itself wants to freeze your marrow. There's no straw yet, no blanket, no mercy, just the ground that centuries of prisoners before you have also cursed. The truth is, medieval prisons weren't designed to rehabilitate or even to house people comfortably. They were meant as holding pens, grim reminders of power. Historians note that early castle keeps doubled as prisons almost by accident. Spaces unused for storage became cells, and people unlucky enough to be thrown inside were simply expected to endure. A mainstream fact here is that the Tower of London, one of the most infamous castles, functioned exactly this way: cold chambers, damp walls, and no thought of comfort. The idea of prisons as correctional institutions, that's centuries away. You, right now, are in a space closer to a pit than a bedroom. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some chroniclers joked that the walls themselves provided companionship. They'd scratch their names into the stone, whispering to the marks left by forgotten souls, as if those etchings were neighbors who might answer back. You glance at the gouged initials around you and suddenly feel less alone, though no warmer. And yet scholars continue to dispute how deliberately harsh these cells were. Some argue the cold was a side effect of architecture: thick stone that trapped winter damp, narrow slits that funneled icy drafts. Others insist the chill was purposeful cruelty, a silent torture meant to weaken body and spirit alike. Either way, your skin prickles and your breath clouds as you lie awake, considering whether you'll even survive till morning. The soundscape becomes your lullaby. Drips of water echo like hollow bells in the corridor. A rat scurries somewhere unseen, claws clicking against the stone. Far above, maybe a guard shifts, boots thumping faintly. Every creak reminds you are locked in, watched or ignored, forgotten in a darkness that feels infinite. You pull your cloak tighter if you're lucky enough to still have it. Many weren't. Imagine sitting here in only your thin woolen shirt, your teeth knocking together like castanets while hours drag. Sometimes you think you feel a breeze, like a ghost brushing against your face, and you wonder whether it's air seeping through the slit window or the memory of someone who froze here centuries ago. You probably won't survive this, not without sheer stubbornness or some miraculous kindness. But then again, survival in medieval jails was rarely about fairness. It was about enduring the night, one freezing breath at a time. The walls don't move, yet they seem to lean closer. Cold does that: it presses, it squeezes, it convinces you you're shrinking. Your heart slows, your limbs ache, and your mind starts conjuring images of hearths you'll never see again. The prisoner beside you, if you even have one, breathes shallow, wrapped into himself like a bundle of sticks. Maybe you envy his ability to sleep at all. And so the first night drags on, measured not by hours but by shivers. No stars guide you, only the endless dark. And in that dark you begin to wonder, is the stone floor harder, or is the cold itself sharper? Which one will claim you first? You wake, if you ever slept at all, with your cheek pressed into something scratchy, sharp, and faintly alive. Straw. It crackles under your weight, but the moment you shift, something skitters away, and you realize you're not alone. Fleas, lice, and maybe even a spider or two have taken up residence in what passes for your bed. You scratch instinctively, only to feel the welt rise immediately under your fingers. Medieval bedding was nothing like the rustic romantic image of hay bales in a barn. Here, in this cell, it's more like lying in a sack of kindling that's been dragged through a pigsty. A mainstream fact: most prisoners across Europe weren't given real bedding. At best, a guard would toss in a handful of straw, a gesture less of compassion than of practicality. It absorbed filth, and was easier to burn and replace than to scrub down stone floors. Accounts from French and English castles describe prisoners crouching on these straw mats for weeks, sometimes months, before the bedding rotted into a sour-smelling sludge. You shift again, and the itch spreads up your arm, a living tide of little jaws. Here's the quirky tidbit. Fleas were so abundant that some prisoners joked about them as roommates, even giving them names. One 14th century satire describes a Sir Itch and a Dame Bite who kept more consistent company than the jailer. You laugh bitterly to yourself. If you're naming the bugs, you know your mind has started to unravel. And yet historians still debate whether the straw was provided with any real thought at all. Was it charity, an attempt to keep men from dying too quickly? Or was it sheer negligence, scraps thrown in only to keep waste from building up to the ceiling? Some suggest guards grew used to the practice because it saved them labor better to shovel out rotten hay than scrape a floor slick with human misery. You lie still, trying to breathe through your nose as the air fills with the sweet, sour stink of decomposing straw, mixed with sweat and damp. Each exhale sends a puff of dust into your face, grains that stick to your lips, and when you cough, the echo is answered by a rustling deeper in the pile rats burrowing into the bedding for their own warmth. The sound of scratching fills the silence, punctuated by your own heartbeat thudding in your ears. You wonder if sleep is even possible, or if this straw mat is nothing more than a stage for torment. The prickling sensation doesn't stop, no matter how much you slap at your skin. Soon you imagine they're crawling inside you, burrowing into your hair, your ears, your clothes. You turn on your side, staring into the shadows. Another prisoner snores softly, oblivious or perhaps resigned. His shoulder rises and falls, his hair a nest of filth. You envy his surrender, though you know he'll wake itching too. The straw shifts again beneath you, like a restless beast, and in that shifting, you feel the true cruelty of this bedding. It promises relief from the stone, but it offers only a different flavor of discomfort. Softer on your bones, but sharper on your mind. You scratch again, wondering if dawn will ever come, or if the fleas will simply drain you first. Your back aches from a night spent twisting on straw that felt more like thorns than bedding. When the guard returns, dragging his boots against the stone, he doesn't bother with words. He shoves aside your heap of vermin-ridden hay and gestures toward the corner where a plank leans against the wall. Tonight, it seems, you graduate to wood. You drag the plank into the middle of the cell, brushing off mold that blooms in green patches along its surface. The smell of damp oak mixes with the ammonia tang of the chamber pot. As you lower yourself, the surface is cruelly uneven. Splinters catch in your tunic. Your spine registers every groove, every knot. You shift again, but the iron ring set in the floor stops you from moving far. Chains clink, cold as winter water, and suddenly the board feels less like a bed and more like a punishment bench. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval prisons offered no straw at all, just wooden planks or bare boards fixed to the wall, sometimes angled so you slid off if you tried to rest too comfortably. Records from London's Newgate prison describe captives chained flat, wrists and ankles stretched to anchor points while lying on planks, their bodies stiffening with the ache of immobility. The quirky tidbit? Some jailers supposedly charged rent for the privilege of a plank. If you couldn't pay, back to the stone you went. In one 15th century account, A thief scraped together a few pennies from sympathetic visitors only to lose his bed again when the guard pocketed the bribe and laughed. You picture the absurdity. Even misery could be taxed. But scholars disagree on whether wooden planks were considered a step up in comfort or a step down in cruelty. Some argue they were hygienic, easier to clean than straw. Others counter they were deliberate torture, designed to keep prisoners half awake, never able to collapse into real rest. You shift your weight again, and the answer seems obvious. The chains bite into your skin, the iron warming only slightly against your ankle. You try to curl your body, but the length of chain is stingy, tugging each time you draw your knees in. The board creaks beneath you, groaning like it resents the company. Every move becomes a negotiation. Endure the splinter pressing your shoulder, or shift and feel the iron dig deeper into your bone. Your ears ring with the silence, broken only by the metallic rhythm of chains scraping with each breath. You imagine the echoes traveling down corridors, reaching others shackled in their cells. Somewhere, another captive coughs, the sound hollow like a church bell struck in a cavern. You try to close your eyes, but your body refuses the lie of rest. The plank is a parody of a bed, a mockery that promises relief and delivers pain. And you know that in this place, sleep itself is a luxury, rationed out like bread or air. You run your tongue along your teeth, feeling grit from the day clinging to your gums. The chains tug again, and the thought strikes you. You are pinned not just to this board, but to the cold logic of imprisonment itself. Here, even your dreams must kneel before the iron. The first thing you notice when darkness settles again is that the chill feels even heavier tonight. It presses down like an extra blanket, only this blanket is made of ice. You curl into yourself, but the plank beneath you offers no kindness. You try rolling toward the wall, hoping the stone will at least block the draft seeping through the arrow slit high above. Instead, the wall feels like a frozen tombstone, leaching away what little warmth your body has stored. Then you hear it, the faint rustle of movement from the other side of the cell. A cough, low and cracked, a body shifting in straw. You aren't alone, and for the first time that fact doesn't scare you. It stirs a small ember of hope. When the night grows cruelest, humans do what livestock have always done, they huddle. You inch closer. The man beside you is gaunt, his face shadowed by the torchlight that seeps in through a half-open door. He doesn't speak, but when you lie shoulder to shoulder with him, neither does he move away. The heat of another body radiates faintly through ragged wool, a reminder that you aren't entirely abandoned to the cold. A mainstream historical fact here. Accounts from prison registers across Europe note that captives often shared sleeping space, not for friendship, but for survival. In Paris, clerks listed entire families jailed together, all pressed into one cell. In England, jails were so overcrowded that men slept literally on top of one another, creating a grim pyramid of bodies to fend off the chill. Whether you liked your fellow inmate or not mattered little. His warmth was a resource as valuable as food. And here comes the quirky tidbit. In certain monasteries turned into makeshift prisons, guards mockingly referred to prisoners as the pigs, not only because they lived in filth, but because they huddled in heaps like penned swine on winter nights. Some even claimed that the smell of sweat and breath steaming in those dark chambers was indistinguishable from a barnyard. You almost laugh at the comparison until you catch the sour tang of your neighbour's breath mixing with your own and realize how accurate the insult might be. Still, historians argue about whether such communal sleeping was tolerated or even encouraged by wardens. Some evidence suggests jailers deliberately crammed captives together, reasoning that the group's collective heat would keep them alive longer, thus preserving their ransom value or court appearance. Others think it was nothing more than negligence. When cells overflowed, there was no choice but to pile men like firewood and leave them to figure out how to endure. The truth probably lay somewhere in between practicality disguised as cruelty. Your companion shivers, and the sound rattles through your bones like a drumbeat. You mimic his curled posture, tucking knees tight against chest, arms folded in. Slowly, Almost imperceptibly, you feel the frost lift a little. Breath mingles, the space between you filled with damp warmth. The smell isn't pleasant sweat, old straw, and unwashed cloth, but you accept it gladly, like a traveller accepts muddy water after days in the desert. Time stretches. Your ear presses against his shoulder blade, and you hear his heart, slow but steady. You realize that in this moment, this stranger's pulse is as comforting as a lullaby. You imagine how many others, across centuries of castles and dungeons, leaned close to someone they might have hated in daylight simply because survival demanded it. And you can't help but wonder how many unlikely alliances were born this way, forged in the furnace of freezing nights. Your mind drifts. You picture a knight and a beggar lying back to back, rank erased by necessity. You imagine a noblewoman, captured during a siege, pressed against the peasant woman who once begged outside her manor gates. The cold equalized everyone here. Chains and frost didn't care about titles. But the night is long, and even shared warmth is fragile. At some point, your companion twitches awake, muttering in his sleep, and rolls away. The distance is immediate. Cold air rushes in like an enemy taking ground. You hesitate. Should you close the gap again? The pride in you whispers, no, but the ache in your bones insists, yes. And so, sheepishly, you shuffle closer, reclaiming what little heat you can. The silence between you holds the weight of an unspoken bargain. We do not speak of this, but we need it all the same. Another sound cuts through, a faint whimper from beyond the bars. You lift your head and notice a second pair of figures curled in the opposite corner. Two boys no older than 14. Their thin frames press so tightly together that you can't distinguish where one ends and the other begins. It strikes you then that this method of survival wasn't limited to hardened criminals or adult prisoners. Even children learned quickly that proximity was the only real blanket offered. You close your eyes again. The cell has become a chorus of breaths, slow, uneven, human. The icy drafts still creep in, but the collective body heat forms a fragile bubble against the worst of it. You know the fleas are still biting, the straw still damp, the chain still heavy, but in this temporary closeness, the misery feels fractionally less. And perhaps that's the cruelest part. Tomorrow, the guard may separate you. Tomorrow, this man whose warmth now seeps into your flesh could be dragged to the gallows. Tomorrow you could wake and find the straw cold, the shoulder beside you gone stiff in death. Nothing here is permanent, not even companionship. But for now, for tonight, you let yourself rest in the fragile comfort of another living body. You drift into half sleep, disturbed only by the occasional groan of timbers overhead and the splash of water dripping from the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls. Perhaps it marks midnight, or perhaps it marks a death. You can't tell. You pull closer still, nestling into warmth that isn't yours but feels like salvation. The morning will bring hunger, more cold, and another round of suffering. But in this one rare, quiet moment, you find that survival isn't always about strength or willpower. Sometimes, it's just about reaching across the dark, pressing close, and pretending, if only for a few hours, that warmth means safety. The air in this part of the castle feels different. Damp still clings to your skin, but there is something else, an echo, a rhythm. You catch it when you quiet your breathing. The low drone of voices somewhere above you. They aren't prisoners muttering in the dark, but monks, their chants rolling down the stone stairwell in syllables you don't understand. The sound wavers between comforting and eerie, as if the prayers themselves hover between heaven and hell. The cell you occupy tonight isn't in the main fortress but in a converted religious building. After all, monasteries were sturdy structures, already equipped with thick walls and lockable rooms. When kings or lords needed extra space for captives, it was easy to transform cloisters into prisons. You lean against the wall and feel the faint vibration of chant, as if the stone itself is humming along. Accounts from the period make clear that many religious houses doubled as jails, both formally and informally. Papal records describe monks tasked with keeping heretics under guard, their cells echoing not only with prayers but with the coughs of the condemned. Some abbots even rented out their unused chambers to local authorities, turning prayer rooms into profit. It wasn't unusual to find prisoners forced to kneel on cold flagstones while vespers sounded just overhead. And there's an odd little story preserved in a 14th century chronicle. In one English priory, prisoners were locked so close to the chapel that they began mimicking the chants, shouting half-learned verses through the grates. The guards called it mockery, but some monks claimed it was evidence of repentance. Imagine that prayer as entertainment in a place where boredom gnawed worse than hunger. Researchers remain divided on what the monks themselves felt about this arrangement. Did they view the prisoners as lost souls, deserving guidance even in chains? Or were they simply burdened hosts, forced to house dangerous men beside their libraries and cloisters? The written evidence is scarce, and the tone of surviving documents shifts from compassion to irritation, leaving us unsure whether charity or convenience was the stronger motive. You stretch out on your straw and listen harder. The chant rises and falls like waves. For a moment, you let the sound carry you, and the chill of the cell seems less sharp. The rhythm has a hypnotic quality, almost like a lullaby. Your eyes grow heavy, but then the voice is cut off, replaced by silence so complete it's almost violent. The absence of sound reminds you just how alone you are. The smell in this place differs from the stench of overcrowded dungeons. Here, the air is tinged with beeswax from the candles above, and occasionally the drifting smoke of incense seeps into the cracks. It mixes strangely with the odors of straw, mildew, and unwashed bodies. You inhale and exhale, torn between gratitude for the distraction and nausea at the clash of scents. Your fellow inmates whisper sometimes, their voices low enough that you only catch fragments. Complaints, prayers, names of families they may never see again. You find yourself whispering too not to them, but to the stone, as if the wall might answer. Maybe that's what countless others did before you. You rub your hand across the surface and feel the shallow carvings left by desperate fingers. Crosses, initials, crude faces, all silent testimonies scratched into limestone, echoing the chants you just heard. Time crawls. A bell rings above, its tone muffled through the layers of stone. Midnight vigils, perhaps. The monks rise for their prayers, and you lie shivering, wondering if they spare even a thought for the captives beneath them. Do they imagine your sleepless body while they kneel on cushioned benches? Or are you forgotten, buried alive beneath holy song? The draught sharpens. You pull your rags tighter, but the cold insists, worming through every seam. Beside you, another prisoner mutters Latin words, not in prayer but in parody. His voice drips with bitterness, mimicking the monk's chant. A guard pounds on the door, silencing him. The echo lingers, though like a shadow you can't shake. The debate over whether such religious settings were kinder or crueler than castle dungeons continues among modern historians. Some argue the proximity to prayer gave captives a thin strand of spiritual comfort, even if their bodies froze. Others insist it heightened the cruelty hearing salvation sung above you while you sat chained in darkness. Both interpretations ring true in your ears as the night lengthens. Sleep comes in fragments. You drift off to the cadence of monks repeating Kyrie eleison, only to wake when the chant ceases and the silence feels unbearable. Dreams blend with reality. Stone cloisters turn into icy cells. Golden altars blur into dripping walls. You wake each time more exhausted than before, unsure if you slept at all. Somewhere in that half-dream, you remember stories of heretics burned at the stake just steps from monasteries that once housed them. You picture yourself dragged from this cell at dawn, hearing hymns above while ropes tie your hands. The thought doesn't scare you as much as it should. It almost feels like the natural conclusion to the song you've been forced to endure. The candlelight from the chapel flickers faintly through a gap in the masonry, thin as a blade. You stare at it until your eyes ache, tracing its movement as if it could cut through your suffering. The flame trembles, and so does your resolve. You wonder whether tomorrow will bring warmth or only more chance to remind you of what you've lost. And as you curl into the straw once more, you whisper words you don't quite mean, imitating the monks above. The syllables taste foreign, but the rhythm is soothing. For a fleeting moment, you believe the chant might carry you somewhere beyond the frost, the fleas, and the darkness. But when the sound dies in your throat, only the silence answers, and the cold remains master of the night. The next day you're marched through a narrow passage, up a spiral staircase that smells of rust and candle smoke, and shoved into a chamber deeper in the castle keep. This one is different again. The walls soar higher, the air feels colder, and the torch on the wall burns with a sullen, uneven flame. You realize quickly, this isn't an improvised cell in a monastery. This is a proper royal dungeon, the kind stories whisper about. Here, stone is not only the floor beneath you, it's the bed, the chair, the blanket, and the coffin all rolled into one. The walls drip with condensation, trails of moisture running like tiny rivers into the grooves of the flagstones. You crouch low, expecting straw or a plank, but there is nothing. Only bare rock, worn smooth by centuries of human weight pressing into it. Chroniclers from the late Middle Ages make it clear that castle dungeons were designed to intimidate as much as restrain. They weren't just holding spaces, they were stage sets for power, reminders to everyone who entered that the crown or the lord controlled life and death. The Tower of London, Chateau d'If, Castel Sant'Angelo across Europe, the same pattern repeated. The dungeon's cold was as famous as its chains. One curious account from a 13th century traveller describes prisoners in Rouen Castle, who swore the stones themselves sucked the warmth from a man like leeches. The chronicler didn't argue the point. He simply noted that those who entered pale left paler still. You run your palm across the flagstone now and feel the same pull, as though the floor has a hunger all its own. Experts remain divided on whether these rooms were meant to be quite so unbearable. Some architectural historians argue that the depth of the keep and the narrowness of the windows were practical. Fortification first, comfort irrelevant. Others believe the design was intentional cruelty, exploiting drafts and darkness as unspoken instruments of punishment. Whichever view is correct, the result is the same: your body trembles uncontrollably, even before night has fallen. As darkness gathers, you notice how the acoustics of a royal dungeon differ from smaller cells. Every movement echoes grotesquely. When you shift, your chains jangle, and the sound ricochets off the vaulted ceiling like mockery. Even your breathing feels too loud, as though the room itself is tattling on you. You imagine guards above, listening to your every rustle. The smell here is sharper too. Without straw to absorb filth, waste and sweat soak directly into the stone, producing a sour, mineral stench that burns your nostrils. You think of the incense drifting through monastery walls and realize how cruel the contrast island. In a place like this, no fragrance but rot survives. You lie flat, pressing your shoulder blades into the rock. The sensation is shocking. It's neither soft nor sharp, it's simply relentless. A pressure that doesn't change no matter how you shift. Hours pass, and your flesh feels bruised, your bones aching as though the stone is shaping itself into you. You roll to your side, but the chains tug tight. Your ankle throbs. Above, faintly, you hear the life of the castle. Boots crossing wooden floors, a dog barking, the creak of a portcullis. All of it drifts down like memories from a world you no longer belong to. You wonder if royalty in their chambers have any thought of the people freezing below. Probably not. For them, the dungeon is useful precisely because it is invisible. You close your eyes and try to imagine firelight. You picture a hearth, embers glowing orange, the crackle of wood. but the dungeon insists on itself. The darkness here is complete, swallowing even the torchlight until it feels like you're floating in a void. You shiver again, realizing that in this place, imagination is the only warmth allowed. And then, in a moment of grim humor, you think of the phrase some guards were said to use, the king's embrace. That's what they called the cold stone floor, because once you lay upon it, it held you tighter than any lover and let you go just as reluctantly. You chuckle under your breath, a sound that bounces back at you from the walls, sounding like another prisoner laughing in the dark. For a moment, you don't feel quite so alone. Your hunger gnaws, but the cold gnaws harder. You curl in on yourself, breath puffing visibly into the air, and tell your body to endure. One more night, you whisper. One more hour. You count heartbeats to trick yourself into thinking time moves faster. Yet the dungeon has its own clock, drips of water falling from the ceiling at maddeningly irregular intervals. Plop. Silence. Plop. Silence. It's a rhythm that denies you the comfort of sleep. There's still uncertainty among historians about how many actually survived long stays in royal dungeons. Some records suggest prisoners lasted months, even years, bargaining with guards for scraps of bedding or coin. Others claim the majority wasted away within weeks, their bodies giving out long before their trials arrived. The truth probably lies in the middle. Survival depended less on strength than on luck, bribery, or noble birth. As the night deepens, your thoughts drift to the world above. Banquets glittering in great halls, music echoing off banners, meat sizzling on spits. You almost taste the fat, smell the roasted herbs, hear the laughter of courtiers, and then you open your eyes again, greeted only by darkness, stone, and the rasp of your own shivering breath. The contrast cuts sharper than any blade. You wrap your arms around yourself and realize this dungeon is not just a prison of stone, it is a prison of sensation, designed to strip away every comfort you've ever known. Here, even the idea of warmth feels like a memory fading into dust. And as you drift toward a fitful, shallow sleep, the stone presses its claim a little deeper, molding you into one more nameless shape in its long history of captives. The iron has a voice of its own. Every time you move, it answers with a clink, a scrape, or a dull thud against stone. By now, the sound has become part of the night's soundtrack: drips of water, scurrying rats, distant doors slamming, and always, always the metal bite of chains. You pull gently against them, testing the links as if tonight might be the night they give way. But they never do. They cut into your ankles with cold precision, a reminder that the only warmth you'll know in this cell comes from friction, not mercy. Written accounts from jails in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire describe iron shackles in meticulous detail. Prisoners were sometimes bound at the wrists, sometimes at the ankles, sometimes both. The weight varied. Some were fixed to the wall with short links that forced crouching. Others dragged heavy lengths of chain that scraped the floor wherever they moved. These restraints weren't only about preventing escape. They were punishments in themselves, reducing circulation, stiffening joints, and chilling the body as metal turned icy in the damp. An especially peculiar anecdote survives in the register of the Bishop of Ely's prison. One prisoner claimed he was so cold that he pressed his wrists to the shackles deliberately, hoping the friction would spark warmth. Of course, the metal only burned colder. You imagine his desperation and almost understand it. Even pain feels like heat compared to the numb ache of this dungeon. Specialists can't quite agree whether chains were applied universally or selectively. Some suggest that every prisoner was shackled as a matter of course. Others argue it depended on rank, and offence nobles might be spared irons, while thieves and debtors bore them constantly. The evidence is patchy, leaving you caught in a debate that scholars still haven't resolved. But tonight, you know only one truth. The shackles are mercilessly real. You stretch your legs, and the chain tugs taut. The iron ring in the floor grinds slightly, a squeal that echoes in the darkness. You try to adjust position, curling your knees up, but the links allow only so much movement. Soon your thighs burn with the effort of finding a posture that doesn't exist. The cold of the iron sinks deeper into your skin until it feels fused with you. You scratch at the raw spots, but there's no relief, only the sense that you're tearing open wounds that will never heal in this place. The sound of your own rattling makes you flinch. It feels as though each clang announces your weakness, sending messages up through the walls to guards you'll never see. You press your chains against the floor, trying to quiet them, but they still vibrate like a bell struck by invisible hands. The smell in this part of the cell is different again. The iron itself has an odor sharp, metallic, almost like blood. It mixes with the mildew and straw until the air feels heavy, flavored with rust. Each breath carries that tang onto your tongue, and you wonder whether you'll taste it for the rest of your life. You try to distract yourself with memory. You picture fields of green, sun warming your shoulders, bare feet against soft earth. You stretch into imagined space, arms wide, legs free. But the moment your real foot jerks against the iron, the fantasy shatters. The chain is louder than your mind. Some prisoners carved patterns into the walls with their shackles, using the iron itself as a crude tool. Circles, scratches, crude words. Archaeologists have found such marks still etched into dungeons centuries later. You run your chain against the wall, testing it. The scrape is satisfying, almost rebellious. But the echo reminds you how futile the gesture island you are etching your existence into rock. Yes, but who will ever see it? The hours drag. Sleep comes only in fragments, each one broken by the pressure of metal against bone. Sometimes you jerk awake because your leg has gone numb, the blood cut off by the band of iron. You shake it out, hear the rattle again, and realize how fully your nights now belong to the chain. Experts haven't reached a consensus on whether shackles shortened lifespans dramatically or simply made them more miserable. Some argue frostbite, infection, and immobility claimed thousands. Others suggest many endured months, even years, with the irons becoming grotesquely familiar. Whatever the statistics, you know the sensation of your own body deteriorating, joints stiffening, circulation failing. And so the night continues with its perverse lullaby. Drip, scrape, clink, thud. You begin to recognize rhythms in it, almost like music. You tap your fingers against your knee in time with the dripping water. Let the chains join in with their own metallic percussion. The dungeon becomes a twisted concert hall, your suffering its only symphony. When your eyes finally close, you dream not of freedom, but of walking through the world still dragging chains, the sound following you everywhere like a curse. In the dream, no one else hears it, only you. You try to shout, but your voice is silent. The rattle continues until you wake, your ankles still burning, your ears still echoing. And as dawn's faint light filters through the arrow slit, you realize the cruelest truth of all. The night didn't silence your shackles. It only taught you to hear them differently. They've become your companions, your captors, and your constant reminder that even in stillness, the cold never truly lets you rest. The night presses on, but it isn't the silence that gnaws at you now. It's the smell. When you first entered this chamber, your nose wrinkled, but you thought you might grow accustomed to it. Instead, the odor grows stronger with every passing hour, as though the walls themselves are sweating rot. You inhale cautiously and taste mildew on your tongue, sour and metallic. The straw you once cursed has already begun to blacken in corners, soaking up urine, sweat, and the occasional vomit from prisoners too weak to crawl toward the slop bucket. Descriptions from contemporary records leave little doubt. Medieval dungeons were as much olfactory assaults as physical ones. Clerks wrote jails where the stench was enough to kill a man not yet sentenced. In some castles, visitors fainted before they even reached the lower chambers. The odor wasn't incidental. It was a constant, woven into the fabric of imprisonment. You lie on your back and realize every breath is punishment, every inhalation a reminder of decay. Curiously enough, some accounts describe guards joking about the perfume of justice. They claimed the smell kept the curious away, and discouraged prisoners from attempting escape through narrow shafts or drains. You can almost picture a smirking warden standing at the threshold, insisting the stench was part of the king's security plan. Dark humor, yes, but in this place, humor is as rare as sunlight. As for how intentional these conditions were, researchers remain divided. Some argue that the filth was simply unavoidable limited water supply, no ventilation, and endless overcrowding. Others believe neglect was deliberate. The worse the conditions, the more terrifying the reputation of the castle. That reputation, in turn, served as deterrent. Both possibilities feel plausible as your stomach turns again and you choke back bile. The air hangs heavy, as if the dungeon itself is a lung exhaling poison. You catch faint whiffs of other layers too, the tang of rust from chains, the musk of unwashed bodies, and beneath it all, the unmistakable stench of death. Somewhere nearby, you think. A body has lain too long unclaimed. Your throat tightens. You know death is everywhere here, sometimes in the straw, sometimes slumped against a wall, sometimes carried away only when the smell grew unbearable. Your ears sharpen in the darkness. A prisoner coughs wetly, spitting into the corner. Another groans in his sleep, muttering curses that dissolve into whimpers. And over it all lingers the oppressive perfume of mildew and waste. You press your sleeve to your face, but the cloth reeks as well. The smell clings, seeps, and insists. At some point, a rat emerges from the shadows, nose twitching. It scampers across your chest before darting toward the corner where the slop bucket overflows. You freeze, then exhale. The rat is unfazed, and you realize with grim acceptance that it, too, is part of the ecosystem of this prison. Rats feast, fleas thrive, mold spreads all while you struggle simply to breathe. Accounts from later centuries suggest some jails burned herbs or scattered lime to combat the odor. But in your present cell, no such comforts exist. The stench is unfiltered, raw, an intimate acquaintance. You begin to wonder if your sense of smell will ever recover, or if every meal you eat, if you ever eat freely again, will taste faintly of rot. There's still disagreement among historians about how much the smell affected survival. Some argue it was demoralizing, breaking spirits more effectively than whips. Others note the spread of disease, suggesting foul air hastened death by pneumonia, fever, or plague. In either case, the conclusion is the same. Prisoners didn't only sleep in cold, they slept in filth that invaded their lungs with every sigh. You roll to your side, trying to escape the draught that carries the odor strongest. But the smell follows, as though it clings to your hair and clothes. You bury your face in your arm, wishing for the faint sweetness of a candle, the freshness of grass, even the acrid smoke of a fire. Anything but this. Time distorts in such an atmosphere. Minutes feel like hours, hours like days. You imagine fresh air as vividly as food. Picture yourself standing in an open field, the breeze carrying scents of hay and rain. You breathe deeply in that fantasy, but the dungeon jerks you back with another lungful of rot. In desperation, you begin to hum quietly, as though a tune might disguise the smell. The vibration distracts your mind for a moment. The man beside you groans, annoyed by the sound. You stop, and the silence returns, heavy as the air itself. Eventually, exhaustion dulls even your senses. Your body resigns itself, no longer flinching with every breath. Instead, the odor becomes background always there, like a second heartbeat. Perhaps this is how survival works in these chambers, not by resisting misery, but by folding it into yourself until it becomes part of you. Yet as you finally drift into a shallow, uneasy slumber, one thought claws at the back of your mind. What if you carry this stink forever? What if, even in freedom, the ghost of mildew, waste, and rot lingers on your skin? The dungeon teaches you that smells, like chains, can outlast the night. The scratching wakes you before dawn. At first you think it's the chains shifting or another prisoner stirring in his sleep. But then you catch the rhythm, tiny claws, sharp and relentless, moving across straw and stone. Your eyes adjust to the gloom, and you see it a rat, bold as a tax collector, nosing around the corner of your bedding. Its whiskers twitch, its eyes gleam faintly in the torchlight filtering from the corridor. You freeze, though you know it isn't fear that stops you. It's fatigue. You simply don't have the strength to chase it away. Surviving records tell us that rodents were constant companions in medieval jails. Rats thrived in the same conditions that destroyed humans: filth, dampness, and abundant scraps of rotting food. Prisoners often complained that the animals didn't just share their space. They claimed their meals, gnawed their clothes, and sometimes nipped at fingers and toes in the night. To live in a cell was to live in a colony, half human, half rodent. And yet one strange story from a German chronicle tells of a prisoner who befriended the rats, feeding them crumbs, so they would leave him unbitten while he slept. Supposedly, the creatures learned to gather around him in silence, a living fur blanket against the cold. Whether true or not, the tale suggests something profound. Even vermin could become allies when loneliness and frost pressed too hard. You watch your rat circle closer to the straw and wonder, absurdly, if he might curl up beside you tonight. As for how authorities regarded this infestation, experts are divided. Some argue that guards saw rats as part of the punishment, let the beasts gnaw, it saved on whips. Others insist the animals were simply unavoidable, too numerous and too hardy to keep out of any structure. Archaeological digs at castle sites reveal gnawed bones and droppings even in storerooms, proving how stubbornly they coexisted with people. Whichever interpretation you prefer, the effect is the same. You are never alone, even when you desperately wish to be. The rat darts forward suddenly, sniffing at your ankle. You jerk, the chain rattles, and the creature vanishes into the shadows with a squeal. But the sound echoes, and more eyes blink open in the dark corners of the cell. You realize there isn't just one. There are dozens, maybe more, all biding their time. Their movements weave through the silence until the dungeon feels alive with a secret society. The smell joins in, of course. Rats carry their own musk, pungent and earthy. Mixed with the rot already saturating the cell, it creates a cocktail of odors that makes your stomach tighten. You gag quietly, not wanting to draw attention, but the effort only makes your head spin. Another prisoner stirs nearby, cursing under his breath as a rat scuttles over him. He kicks at the straw, the chains clanging angrily. The rats scatter for a moment but return as quickly as water finds cracks. They know patience. They know hunger. In some ways, you think, they mirror the prisoners themselves. And here lies the cruel truth. After hours of shivering, you begin to understand the appeal of their warmth. You imagine the German tale again, the prisoner sleeping beneath a quilt of fur, tiny hearts beating in unison with his own. Could you do it? Could you let them climb over you, nestle into your rags, all for the sake of heat? You shake your head, revolted. Yet the longer you shiver, the more that question lingers, refusing to vanish. The scratching continues, a constant undercurrent. Your ears tune to it until it seems as loud as voices. Sometimes you hear squeaks, short and sharp, almost like conversation. You picture the rats whispering about you, which part of you they'll gnaw first, which scraps you'll drop in the night. The thought is ridiculous, but exhaustion makes it real. Historians continue to puzzle over how prisoners coped with such infestations. Some accounts describe endless scratching and swatting, nights spent sleepless in defense of one's toes. Others hint at resignation: men who stopped resisting, allowing the rats to crawl freely as long as they didn't bite too hard. The lack of consensus mirrors your own indecision. Resist and exhaust yourself, or surrender and save strength. Neither feels like victory. The hours creep by, measured not by bells but by the rats' movements. At one point, you hear the faint sound of gnawing at wood. They're chewing through something, perhaps the plank meant to bar the door, perhaps nothing important at all. But in your half-dreaming mind, you picture them tunneling your escape. A ridiculous hope, but a hope nonetheless. Eventually, fatigue wins. You close your eyes, knowing they're still there. You hear them still, feet on straw, claws on stone, teeth on wood. But the sound becomes part of the night's music. Your body surrenders to sleep. You dream of fields again. But this time, rats run through the grass, their whiskers brushing your hands, their warmth pressed to your skin. Even in dreams, you can't escape them. When you wake, dawn's light barely filters through the slit window. The rats have retreated to their corners, leaving only droppings scattered near your feet. You sigh, half disgusted, half relieved. Another night survived. Another night shared with creatures who know nothing of kings or laws, only hunger and warmth. In this cell, they are your equals, and perhaps, though you'd never admit it, your companions. The days blur together, but tonight something different greets you. When the guard slams the iron door, he tosses a ragged bundle into the straw. At first you think it's waistcloth, but when you unfurl it, you realize it's meant to be a blanket, or at least the cruel parody of one. The cloth is threadbare, edges unraveling, and it smells as though it has passed through a dozen other cells before yours. Still, when your fingers trace the frayed threads, you clutch it tightly, because in a dungeon like this, even the illusion of warmth feels like treasure. Written accounts from civic records confirm that prisoners were rarely given proper bedding. Sometimes they received nothing at all, and when scraps of cloth were handed down, it was usually old uniforms or discarded sackcloth. Chronicles from the 14th century mention coats of shame, garments stripped from executed men and recycled into coverings for the living. Imagine wrapping yourself in a dead man's tunic, hoping his scent might keep the rats away while you try to rest. That is the level of comfort these scraps offered. An odd anecdote survives from Florence, where a debtor imprisoned in the city jail supposedly stitched together a quilt out of parchment scraps smuggled in by friends. He survived winter under that bizarre creation, sleeping beneath contracts, letters, and holy verses inked onto sheepskin. The story may be exaggerated, but the image lingers. Paper warmed him when no wool could be spared. As for whether blankets were a common provision, scholars remain uncertain. Some point to inventories of prison stores that list textiles alongside food. Others argue that those lists reflected bribes or privileges, not standard issue. The reality is murky, but your body knows the truth. Whatever arrives is never enough. You drape the cloth over your shoulders, and the first shock is how cold it feels. Instead of shielding you from the air, it seems to trap the dampness against your skin. You pull it tighter, but the weave is so thin that drafts pass straight through, like wind through reeds. Still, you cling to it. The weight, however feeble, is something to hold on to, something to convince yourself you are not entirely naked to the elements. The smell, though, is almost unbearable. Sweat, mildew, and something darker cling to every fibre. You bury your nose in it and gag, then force yourself to continue. The alternative is surrendering to the cold, and you know what that means. Survival often comes down to choosing which misery you can endure longer. Tonight, you choose stink over frostbite. The other prisoners notice your new luxury. One mutters envy. Another asks for a corner of it when the drafts grow worse. You hesitate, then share, stretching the blanket so thin, it becomes little more than a cobweb between you. The warmth is negligible, but the gesture builds an unspoken alliance. In a cell where even breathing feels like competition, a scrap of cloth becomes the currency of trust. As the night deepens, you shift endlessly beneath the rag. No position feels right. The blanket slides off your shoulders, tangles around your ankles, or clings damply to your chest. Each adjustment brings only temporary relief, yet you keep adjusting, because the act itself wards off despair. You are doing something, however futile, to fight the cold. Historians argue about whether such thin coverings were symbolic rather than practical. Some suggest they represented mercy proof that jailers had not abandoned humanity altogether. Others believe they were strategic, keeping captives alive but weak, balanced on the knife edge between survival and collapse. Whatever their intention, you feel the symbolism clearly. This rag is a reminder that you are allowed to suffer, but not allowed to die too quickly. The sounds of the night seem sharper with cloth brushing against your ears. You hear the whistle of drafts, the moans of prisoners curling in their corners, the constant gnaw of rats. Each sound blends with the rasp of fabric shifting as you toss and turn. It becomes a rhythm, a harsh lullaby, and you drift into shallow sleep despite yourself. But sleep brings dreams laced with irony. You imagine yourself wrapped in velvet, feasting at a noble table, only to wake choking on the sour stench of your blanket. You dream of sunlight warming a linen sheet hung in the wind, only to open your eyes to damp rags clinging like a leech. Even in your mind, the dungeon claws back what little comfort you managed to steal. By dawn, the cloth is soaked with your sweat. It clings heavily, like swamp water trapped around your body. You peel it off, hold it at arm's length, and for a moment consider abandoning it altogether. But when the draft cuts across your bare shoulders, you clutch it back, pressing it against your skin once more. That is the final lesson this rag teaches you. In a dungeon, comfort is relative. What disgusts you tonight may save you tomorrow. What makes you gag may also keep your heart beating. And as long as breath fogs in the freezing air, you'll wrap yourself in anything, no matter how foul, if it promises even a whisper of warmth. You think you've grown used to the rhythm of these nights, but the seasons have a way of rewriting every rule. Tonight, winter has fully claimed the dungeon, and the cold feels different, sharper, hungrier. It doesn't just creep into your bones, it pierces them, as if each gust carries knives. You curl beneath your ragged scrap of blanket, press your knees tight against your chest, and still your teeth chatter so hard you fear they'll crack. Chroniclers left plenty of testimony about how the seasons transformed prison life. In summer, cells became suffocating ovens, the heat trapped by stone, the air thick with disease. In winter, they became ice boxes where breath hung visibly in the air, forming clouds that never dissipated. Some accounts even claim that in particularly brutal winters, prisoners woke to frost clinging to their eyebrows and beards, as though the night had painted them into statues. You run your fingers along your own face, half expecting to feel crystals forming there. One particularly strange note appears in a 15th century London jail record. Guards joked that the frost does the whipping for us. The implication was cruelly simple. Why bother punishing captives when the weather itself could do the job? You laugh bitterly at the thought, your breath curling like smoke in front of your face. And yet scholars remain divided over whether medieval builders understood how brutal these seasonal shifts would be. Some suggest that castles were so focused on defense, thick walls, arrow slits, deep vaults, that comfort was never considered. Others argue that the misery of changing temperatures was embraced as part of the punishment, an invisible lash dealt by climate itself. Perhaps both are true, and you, lying here with frozen toes, are the proof. You shift again, but the straw beneath you has stiffened with frost. Each stalk crunches as though it were glass, biting into your skin. You long for warmth, but every surface, stone, straw, iron, has turned into an accomplice of the cold. Even your own body betrays you, trembling violently, using energy you cannot replace. Hunger makes it worse. With no fuel, shivers fade into weakness, and weakness fades into a stillness more dangerous than sleep. The sounds around you tell their own story of the season. Prisoners cough more often now, hacking up phlegm that freezes almost as soon as it hits the ground. Someone wheezes, each breath a struggle. The rats, too, seem bolder, perhaps desperate for scraps in this harsher climate. You hear them gnawing at wood with renewed fervor, their squeaks sharper, more frantic. You think of summer and almost laugh. Then, the cell suffocated with stench, every prisoner slick with sweat, every breath heavy with flies. You remember complaints in chronicles about cells so hot they doubled as ovens, and captives so desperate they licked condensation from the walls for relief. The contrast is staggering. This place swings from fire to ice, neither survivable for long. One night in August, people would have traded everything for a breath of cool air. Now, in December, you'd give anything for the sting of summer heat. That is the cruel symmetry of the dungeon. You always long for what is gone, never blessed with balance. Some historians propose that prisoners developed their own rituals to cope with these extremes, sleeping in shifts so that body heat rotated, or gathering into tight groups like soldiers around a campfire. There are hints in letters smuggled from debtors' prisons of men pressing back to back, not out of friendship but survival. The practice may have saved lives, but it also blurred lines of dignity. Imagine clutching a stranger close, not because you wished to, but because death by frostbite felt closer than shame. The man beside you stirs and inches toward your side. At first you tense, but then you feel his shoulder against yours, radiating faint warmth. You don't resist. Neither of you speaks, but the gesture says what words cannot. We're both trying to outlast the cold, and pride has no place here. Hours stretch. At some point, your body stops shivering. This frightens you more than the trembling did, because you've heard tales of men who froze to death precisely when they thought the cold was finally easing. A deceptive comfort, a soft descent into stillness. You slap your arms, rub your thighs, do anything to keep circulation alive. Even pain feels like victory against numbness. Opinions differ among modern researchers about how common death by exposure really was inside castles. Some argue that hunger and disease killed more captives than climate ever did. Others point to mass graves near old jails, suggesting winters wiped out entire cells in single weeks. The truth, as always, is uncertain. But in the icy silence of this night, statistics don't matter. Your survival narrows down to the next breath, the next shiver, the next stubborn decision not to give up. At last, a faint change in light creeps through the arrow slit. Dawn is coming, pale and grey, but still a promise. The frost on the walls glitters faintly. You push yourself upright, every joint protesting, and realize you have survived another night of winter's rain. And yet deep down, you know this survival is provisional. The cold will return tonight, and the night after, and every night until spring. And even then, relief will only mean the suffocating heat of summer. You are trapped in a place where seasons are not blessings but new forms of punishment. Each change of weather rewrites your misery in fresh ink. You curl back into the straw, breath still fogging in the air, and whisper to yourself, "Endure." The word echoes against the stone. A fragile mantra, almost a prayer. Endure, because in this dungeon, endurance is the only weapon left to you. The guards shove you into a new chamber, and at first you're too dazed to notice the difference. The door slams, chains scrape, and then your eyes adjust. This isn't the dripping pit of the dungeon or the makeshift cell in a cloister. The walls here are smooth, whitewashed, and decorated with faded tapestries. A fireplace yawns in the corner, its embers still faintly glowing. For a moment, you wonder if you've been released. But no, the iron bars still gleam at the door. You haven't escaped prison. You've stumbled into another world, the prison of the wealthy. Records from the medieval period make it clear that captivity was not experienced equally. Wealthy prisoners of war, noble hostages, or politically significant captives often slept in relative comfort. Feathers, cushions, even servants sometimes attended them. They were valuable. After all, ransom demanded that they survive. Chroniclers in France wrote of knights captured in battle who spent their imprisonment in furnished chambers, their only humiliation the loss of freedom, not warmth. And there's an almost comical detail from a Burgundian court account. A captured noble complained not of chains or straw, but of the inferior wine served with his supper. His grievance was recorded seriously, as if bad vintages were a legitimate form of suffering. You laugh under your breath, half from bitterness, half from the absurdity of comparing that man's complaint to the filth you've endured. Experts still debate how widespread such luxury captivity truly was. Some argue that noble prisoners were the exception, their treatment highlighted in records precisely because it was unusual. Others believe it was standard practice among the elite, a reflection of a society where rank determined even the texture of your prison bed. The truth lies somewhere in the shadows, but the evidence of feather beds, roaring hearths, and books provided to captives remains too numerous to dismiss. You sit gingerly on the bed provided here, a real bed, stuffed with feathers. The mattress sighs beneath your weight, soft in ways your body has nearly forgotten. For an instant, relief washes through you. Your aching joints sink. Your raw skin welcomes the absence of straw. The blanket, though rougher than those of true nobility, is heavy and warm. Compared to the rags of the dungeon, this feels like sinking into a dream. But the comfort is unsettling. You can't help but think of the others, men and women freezing on stone, gnawed by rats, gasping in filth. Their misery echoes in your memory, and suddenly the softness beneath you feels almost shameful. It whispers privilege, luck, and a reminder that even in chains, society divides its people. The fire crackles, weak but real, and for the first time in weeks, you see light dancing on the walls. The smoke curls upward, and you inhale greedily. It smells of wood, not waste, not rot. You could almost weep from the sweetness of it. Your toes thaw slowly, tingling painfully as sensation returns. You tuck them beneath the blanket, frightened to let go of the warmth, frightened to believe it will last. The guard returns once, carrying a tray. Coarse bread, yes, but bread that hasn't been gnawed first by vermin. A cup of watered wine. You eat in silence, each bite reminding you that you've been thrust into a category apart, the prisoner whose survival matters. Perhaps you are useful. Perhaps your name carries weight. Perhaps someone powerful wants you alive. Whatever the reason, it buys you another night of relative peace. Yet peace here has its own barbs. You hear footsteps above, voices of courtiers laughing, the scrape of chairs against polished floors. Life continues just overhead, reminding you that your gilded prison is still a cage. You imagine a noble upstairs complaining of the draught while you, technically a prisoner, huddle near a fire like an honored guest. The irony burns hotter than the hearth. Researchers point out that such privileged confinement sometimes softened captives into collaborators. Treated well, they were more likely to sign treaties, reveal secrets, or pledge loyalty. Others suggest the opposite, that too much comfort prolonged their torment, leaving them alive long enough to witness humiliation. Whatever the motivation, it's clear that luxury imprisonment was never pure kindness. It was strategy wrapped in velvet. You lie back, staring at the ceiling. The bed is too soft. It makes your back ache in new ways. You shift, restless, as though your body mistrusts ease. Sleep comes reluctantly, your mind replaying the clatter of chains and the rustle of straw as if comfort itself has become suspicious. Perhaps that is the final cruelty, to remind you what warmth feels like, only so you can dread its loss tomorrow. Dreams return, but they are confusing. You walk through a castle where some rooms are dungeons and others are banquet halls. You slip from straw to velvet, from rags to gowns, unable to tell which fate is real. The dream dissolves into firelight, and you wake with sweat on your brow, though the air is still icy. By dawn, the embers in the fireplace have cooled. The room is chill again, though not as merciless as the pits you've known. You sit on the bed, blanket around your shoulders, and realize that even in relative comfort, captivity warps everything. Warmth feels like betrayal, food tastes like guilt, and rest leaves you more tired than before. Luxury, in this place, is no gift. It is another chain softer, heavier, and perhaps harder to break. The comfort of that feather mattress fades quickly from memory once the guards drag you back down into the bowels of the castle. The descent itself is dizzying. Torchlight flickers against spiral stone stairs. The air grows steadily colder, and the sounds of the upper world, laughter, music, even footsteps, fall away into silence. At last the door groans open, and you're pushed into a cell directly beneath the guardroom. You can tell because of the noise overhead. Every creak of timber, every shift of boots, every lazy scrape of dice on a table filters down through the cracks. The floor above becomes a constant ceiling of sound, reminding you that life goes on for your captors even as you shiver below. You lie on your straw, staring upward, listening as men laugh at jokes you can't hear, as mugs clink, as chairs scrape across planks. The weight of their warmth presses down on you, audible but untouchable. Documentation from medieval prisons confirms that many cells were positioned directly under guardrooms. The arrangement was practical, easy supervision, quick access in case of escape, and the added cruelty of letting prisoners hear the world of freedom just out of reach. In the Tower of London, for instance, cells under the Beauchamp Tower echoed constantly with guards' chatter, the thud of weapons being sharpened, and the roll of dice. The architecture itself ensured prisoners lived in a permanent state of audible envy. A curious tale from a French castle describes a man who claimed he could tell time by the noises of the guardroom. He knew dawn when chairs scraped back for the morning shift, knew noon when mugs clattered with ale, and knew midnight when dice rattled one last time before silence fell. In the absence of sunlight, the rhythm of jailers became his calendar. You imagine yourself developing the same skill, ears turned upward like a monk, following the bells of an unseen monastery. As for whether this was deliberate cruelty or mere convenience, scholars are still split. Some argue it was designed, what better reminder of power than forcing captives to hear guards laugh while they froze. Others believe it was simply logistical, the layout of castles leaving little choice. Either way, the result remains the same. Your nights are haunted not by silence, but by the reminder that warmth and ease exist directly overhead, and not for you. The smell here is different again. Instead of pure mildew, the air carries the scent of smoke drifting down from the guardroom fire. It mingles with the stench of your cell, creating a cruel perfume, half comfort, half filth. Your stomach growls when roasted meat wafts through the cracks, and you almost laugh at the absurdity of hunger triggered by smells you'll never taste. You shift on your straw, but the sound of boots stomping above drowns even your own movements. The ceiling seems alive with footsteps, each thud a reminder of the bodies warm with blood and food. You close your eyes, but the noise remains, pressing into your skull like an unwelcome lullaby. Hours stretch, measured by the shifting tones of the guardroom. At one point, voices rise in a bawdy song. The melody filters through stone, muffled but insistent. You find yourself humming along despite yourself, the tune echoing oddly in the darkness of your chamber. For a fleeting moment, you feel part of the living world again, until a boot stomps in rhythm, and laughter follows, reminding you that the singers above would never share their warmth with the shivering below. The psychological weight of such sounds is not lost on modern researchers. Some suggest that hearing life so close but unreachable intensified despair, breaking spirits faster than isolation. Others argue it offered a thread of connection, preventing captives from slipping entirely into madness. The ambiguity persists, much like your own mixed feelings as you lie awake, caught between comfort in the noise and torment in the exclusion it represents. At some point in the night, silence finally falls. No footsteps, no laughter, no clinking mugs. You hold your breath, the absence of sound ringing louder than the noise itself. Then a single creak of timber interrupts, as if someone is still awake above. You strain your ears, wondering if a lone guard listens back, aware of you listening to him. The thought unsettles you. Are you the prisoner or the entertainment? You curl tighter into your blanket scrap, pressing your ear against the straw to muffle the overhead world. But even through layers of cloth, the sounds reach you. You realize there is no true silence here, only a shifting chorus of reminders. The guardroom never leaves you, not even when the men above are asleep. Their weight creaks in the wood, their fire smoulders, their presence lingers. And so the night passes, not in solitude, not in silence, but in endless awareness of others' comfort just beyond your reach. You learn to measure time not by bells, not by light, but by boots on planks and laughter carried through cracks. The irony is sharp, you are imprisoned in darkness, yet the lives of your captors illuminate every hour. By dawn, the guards above stir again, chairs scrape back, mugs thud down. Their day begins just as yours never ended. You rise stiffly from your straw, eyes on the ceiling, and realize you have spent the entire night listening to footsteps you could never follow. You think the guardroom's chatter is the worst soundtrack imaginable, but tonight the castle proves you wrong. Once the torches are extinguished and the corridors above fall silent, another kind of noise begins to fill the darkness. At first it's faint, an uneven moan drifting from somewhere down the hall. Then, as your ears sharpen, the whole dungeon becomes a theatre of voices. Songs, sobs, prayers, curses, and the unearthly scrape of chains dragging across stone. Written descriptions from medieval prisons reveal that nights were rarely silent. Jails were packed with people of every background: soldiers, thieves, debtors, heretics, beggars, even children, and each brought their own sounds of misery. Chroniclers in Florence noted that the prison near the Ponte Vecchio could be heard from the street outside, its chorus of weeping and wailing carrying through windows like a grotesque lullaby. Tonight you understand how that could be true, for the walls themselves seem to breathe with voices. An especially odd anecdote comes from a 15th century Spanish account. A jailer reported that prisoners once tried to drown out their own despair by singing hymns together. The guards called it mockery, but one monk insisted it was proof of faith surviving in darkness. You listen closely now, and swear you hear something similar: two men, murmuring a tune that might be prayer, might be parody, drifting into harmony for a heartbeat before dissolving into coughing fits. As for whether this nightly chorus was tolerated or suppressed, historians still wrestle with the evidence. Some argue that jailers allowed noise as long as it didn't threaten escape, better to let prisoners exhaust themselves with shouting. Others believe silence was enforced harshly, with beatings for anyone who sang or moaned too loudly. The truth is impossible to fix. All you know is that your own night is pierced by voices you cannot escape. The air vibrates with layers of sound. A man in the corner mutters endlessly, words looping back on themselves until they blur into nonsense. Another calls out for his mother, the syllables ragged, heartbreaking. From somewhere above, you hear a faint chant in Latin, maybe a monk, maybe just another captive repeating scraps of scripture. The noises overlap until your mind begins to weave them together into strange rhythms, a choir of despair echoing through the damp corridors. You shift in your straw, trying to block it out, but the voices follow you. Each groan and rattle of chains feels personal, as though directed at you. You cover your ears with your hands, yet the stone amplifies every sound. Even silence between cries feels like a pause in music, waiting for the next verse of suffering. The smell of damp and rot mingles with the sound, creating a full assault of the senses. Each sob seems to release another wave of stink, as if grief itself has a scent. You breathe shallowly, but still it clings. And then, cutting through the misery, comes laughter. It startles you, sharp, sudden, rising out of nowhere. Someone, impossibly, has found humor in this place. The laugh is high, broken, bordering on madness. Yet it spreads, echoing down the corridor until it sounds like a chorus. You feel your own lips twitch. Is it contagion? Desperation? Or is there something genuinely funny about this shared doom? The laughter fades as quickly as it began, leaving silence so heavy you almost miss the wailing. Modern researchers often note the psychological effects of such soundscapes. Constant noise breaks sleep, frays nerves, and erodes sanity. Some argue that the dungeon's cacophony was itself a form of torture, depriving captives of rest even when chains didn't bind them. Others suggest that voices reminded prisoners they weren't alone. The shared suffering was a fragile kind of comfort. Listening now, you feel both interpretations at once, comfort and torment, braided inseparably together. Hours crawl past. The song of misery shifts in tone, sometimes rising, sometimes falling like the tide. At one point, a deep, resonant voice begins to chant a ballad of lost battles, his verses carrying above the noise. You close your eyes and let the melody wash over you. For a moment, it feels like sitting by a hearth, listening to a bard. Then the man coughs blood, and the illusion shatters. The night ends not with silence, but with exhaustion. The voices weaken, fade into snores, groans, or the eerie stillness of bodies that may never stir again. You lie awake, ears ringing with echoes that linger long after the sound has ceased. When the guard opens the door at dawn, light slices in, and you realize you've spent another night not in darkness, but in a symphony of human suffering. And the cruelest part is this: you know you'll hear it again tomorrow, and the next night, until the echoes live inside your head forever. Your stomach has been gnawing at itself for days, but tonight the hunger feels sharper because of the smell. Somewhere above, in the kitchens of the castle, a feast is being prepared. The draught through the arrow slit carries whispers of roasting meat and herbs, the kind of aroma that once meant celebration. Down here, it is torture. You close your eyes and try to focus on anything else, but the scent lingers, wrapping around your ribs like a cruel reminder that you are starving. Accounts from medieval jails are unflinching about the rations prisoners received. Bread, often mouldy, water, sometimes brackish. On rare occasions, a ladle of thin gruel. Civic records from Paris list prison diets as little more than crusts collected from markets. Chroniclers in England complained that debtors were left to starve unless friends or family sent food. Hunger wasn't an accident. It was a design. Prisoners were meant to be kept alive, but just barely. An unusual note comes from a Milanese record in the 14th century. A man jailed for theft reported dreaming nightly of banquets he had once served as a kitchen boy. He swore that the smells drifting into his cell were more vivid than any hallucination, and claimed that in hunger, the imagination itself cooked meals for you. Lying here now, with your mouth watering at phantom flavors, you understand precisely what he meant. Historians argue over whether hunger was considered punishment or simply neglect. Some suggest deliberate rationing was a way to weaken captives, making escape impossible. Others point to evidence that prison keepers pocketed food money, leaving inmates to fend for themselves. The question remains unresolved, but your stomach doesn't care about motives. It growls regardless. You curl tighter under your scrap of blanket, trying to ignore the pangs. The straw beneath you rustles, and you imagine it bread crusts, golden and crisp. You picture lifting them to your mouth, chewing slowly. Instead, your hand closes on nothing but brittle stalks that crumble to dust. Your throat aches with disappointment. Around you, other prisoners mumble in their sleep, some calling out for food aloud. One repeats the word bread like a mantra. Another groans, cheese, 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 until his voice fades into snores. Hunger doesn't just torment the body, it haunts the mind, invading dreams until even sleep offers no refuge. You think back to meals you once took for granted, a stew bubbling over a fire, the scent of onions and herbs, a crust of bread warm enough to steam, butter melting into pores of dough. The images rise unbidden, sharper than reality itself. You bite your lip to stop the saliva from pooling, But it's useless. Hunger has colonized every corner of your imagination. Some modern researchers propose that starvation in prisons was not only physical punishment, but psychological warfare. By keeping prisoners weak, jailers ensured their willpower dissolved. Hungry men are easier to control, easier to bargain with, easier to break. Others counter that many jails were simply too poor to provide more. Both interpretations hold weight. But in your belly, theory means nothing. Pain is the only fact. You try to distract yourself with the noises around you. Rats scurry, water drips, chains clink. Normally these sounds would irritate, but now you welcome them. Anything to drown out the growling of your stomach. Yet even the rats remind you of food they scavenge more effectively than you, finding scraps in corners you cannot reach. One darts past carrying what looks like a crumb of bread. You almost lunge at it, but the chain on your ankle stops you short. The rat disappears, victorious. Hours drag. Your hunger sharpens into nausea, then dulls into a heavy ache. You know the stages. The first night brings pangs, the second weakness, the third a dangerous stillness. You rub your arms to keep moving, to trick yourself into believing you still have strength. Then, faintly, a prisoner begins to hum. At first you think it's another hymn, but soon the melody forms words he is singing about food. Roasted goose, spiced wine, sweet apples. The others groan, telling him to stop, but his voice carries stubbornly on. Oddly, it soothes you. You drift into the song, imagining the feast as if it were real. Hunger turns the cruel lullaby into comfort. Eventually, your body forces rest. Dreams come quickly, and they are filled with tables groaning under food. You sit at the head, eating endlessly, each bite dissolving as soon as it touches your tongue. The dream turns mocking you, chew and swallow, but you never feel full. You wake with your teeth grinding against straw, jaw aching from the phantom feast. When dawn's pale light slips through the slit, you rise slowly, weaker than before. Your belly is hollow, but your resolve, oddly, feels sharper. Hunger has stripped you, but it has also carved you. You whisper to yourself, voice hoarse, survive. The word rings louder than the growls of your stomach. For in this cell, starvation is not just about food, it is about teaching you that even your own body cannot be trusted. Hunger is another jailer, always watching, always waiting. And tonight, you realize, it has become your closest companion. The hunger from last night doesn't fade. It sharpens your awareness of every stone, every draught, every sound. But what grows strongest tonight isn't your stomach, it's your mind. You lie awake on the damp floor and your thoughts refuse to stay quiet. You begin planning escape, as if imagining freedom might trick your body into feeling warm. Medieval chronicles mention countless failed escapes. Some tried to bribe guards with coins hidden in boots. Others filed away at locks with bits of smuggled metal. A few dug tunnels, scraping through stone and earth with spoons, bones, even bare hands. Most were caught quickly, the holes collapsing, the guards suspicious. Yet the very act of planning gave prisoners something to live for, a reason to survive one more night. You too start whispering schemes in your mind, building blueprints out of shadows. A peculiar story survives in a 14th century German town record. One man supposedly trained rats to gnaw at his wooden door by smearing it with bacon fat. For weeks he fed them scraps, until finally the door weakened enough for him to slip through. Whether the tale is exaggerated or not, the idea feels intoxicating. You look at the scurrying creatures in your own cell and wonder, allies or enemies? Experts disagree about how common escape attempts were in great castles. Some argue the thickness of the walls and the vigilance of guards made most plans futile, turning fantasies into nothing more than nighttime distractions. Others insist that escapes happened more often than records suggest, since authorities were embarrassed to admit failure. The debate matters little to you now. What matters is the faint flame of possibility that flares each time you trace the outline of your chain. You tug at the iron once more. The clink echoes, but you measure its length carefully. Could you reach the wall if you stretched? Could you chip at the mortar with the chain's edge? Your fingers itch with the idea. You imagine scratching night after night, patient as dripping water, until the stone gives way. Your body joins in the fantasy. Each draft becomes a secret passage of air. Each rat hole becomes the mouth of a tunnel. The drip of water sounds like a clock counting down the hours until freedom. You close your eyes and see yourself crawling through the earth, emerging into moonlight, lungs gulping fresh air that doesn't stink of mildew. You run barefoot across frost-covered grass, chains still dragging but heart racing toward liberty. But then a cough breaks the spell. A prisoner across the chamber chuckles bitterly and mutters. No one leaves. His words strike harder than the cold. You realize he has seen others try, seen them fail, perhaps seen them hanged as warning. The fantasy dims, but it doesn't extinguish. You cling to it, because without it, the night offers nothing but despair. The air grows sharper. You press the scrap of blanket to your shoulders, still picturing tunnels, bribes, disguises. You imagine knocking a guard unconscious with a stone, stealing his keys. You imagine bribing him with promises of gold hidden in a far-off field. You imagine miracles, angels, even the earth itself opening to let you climb free. Modern researchers describe this kind of dreaming as mental survival. They suggest captives kept themselves alive not by strength of body, but by strength of imagination. Some prisoners scribbled verses on walls, others carved ships or animals into stone, turning fantasy into art. Without such visions, the monotony of suffering might have consumed them faster than starvation. You run your fingers along the wall, searching for soft mortar. You scratch once, twice. Dust falls under your nail. It feels like victory, though you know it is nothing. Still, you keep scratching, as if each grain loosened is a step toward daylight. The rhythm calms you, gives your restless thoughts a purpose. Sleep refuses to come. You toss, shift, scratch, plan. The guardroom above creaks faintly, reminding you of those who hold the keys. You picture their laughter again, and the image fuels your plotting. Revenge twines with escape in your imagination. One day you think, I'll be the one laughing overhead while they freeze below. But dawn eventually arrives without miracle. You are still chained, still starved, still cold. The wall bears only a faint scratch, invisible to anyone but you. Yet that tiny mark feels precious. It is proof you resisted not with strength, but with hope. The night has taught you something cruel but essential. The mind is the only escape a prisoner can guarantee. And as long as you keep dreaming of tunnels, rats, or even impossible miracles, you carry a spark the dungeon cannot steal. The cold is bad enough, the hunger cruel, but nothing quite compares to the night you spend knowing tomorrow might be your last. Word spreads quickly through the prison someone is to be executed at dawn. The whispers slither through cracks and corridors until they reach your ears, and then the realization dawns. It's you. From that moment, sleep becomes a stranger. You lie on your straw, listening to the rasp of your own breath, and the cell feels tighter than ever. The stone presses in, the chains feel heavier, and every drip of water sounds like the ticking of a clock. You are trapped not only by walls, but by time itself. Contemporary records tell us that the eve of execution was deliberately cruel. Some prisoners were left in darkness, denied food, and forced to dwell on their fate. Others were paraded before fellow captives, a grim warning of what awaited them. The Tower of London's registers describe how condemned men were sometimes moved to colder, deeper cells on their final night. The chill itself, acting as an unspoken rehearsal for the grave. You shift against your straw and realize that is exactly what this chamber feels like, a rehearsal. A peculiar anecdote survives from a Burgundian account. One man scheduled for hanging reportedly sang all night, his voice echoing through the jail, until guards begged him to stop. He refused, claiming he wanted his last memory to be his own song, not their silence. You wonder if you should do the same, but your throat feels dry and your courage thinner than parchment. Historians still debate how much forewarning captives were given. Some believe prisoners knew their fate days in advance, enduring prolonged psychological torment. Others argue executions were often surprises, sprung without notice to prevent escape attempts. The uncertainty makes the experience worse. Tonight you know, and that knowledge gnaws harder than hunger. You try to rest, but every position reminds you of the morning. Lying flat feels like a corpse laid out. Curling tight feels like begging. Sitting up makes you dizzy, as if the rope already squeezes your neck. Your imagination betrays you. Every creak of wood becomes the scaffold being built. Every rustle of straw, the shuffle of executioners' boots. The cell grows colder, though you cannot tell if it's the night or your own fear. You clutch the ragged blanket, pulling it over your head like a child, but the dark inside is worse. Your breath grows hot beneath the cloth, and you throw it off, only to shiver harder. Nothing shields you from tomorrow. Around you, the other prisoners are restless too. Some whisper prayers, some murmur encouragement you don't believe. Others keep silent, unwilling to acknowledge your fate. Their voices echo like a chorus of ghosts, and you realize that soon you will join them not as flesh, but as memory. The hours crawl. You think of food, but it no longer matters. You think of freedom, but the fantasy feels foolish. Your thoughts circle back, always, to the rope, the blade, the fire, whatever end awaits. You imagine the crowd, their faces hungry for spectacle. You imagine the priest's final words, muffled by the roar of your own heartbeat. Modern researchers note that death row insomnia was nearly universal. Few captives slept before execution, and those who did woke screaming from nightmares. Some left graffiti on cell walls, names, prayers, desperate sketches. Archaeologists have uncovered these final scratches, carved into stone with fingernails or broken pottery. You glance at your wall and feel the urge to mark it too, but your hands tremble too much to etch. Instead, you press your palm flat against the cold surface, leaving only the memory of your touch. The rats still scurry, the drafts still moan, the smells of mildew and waste still cling, but tonight you hardly notice them. The true prison is your own racing mind, darting between terror and resignation. You imagine running, but chains hold you. You imagine fighting, but weakness wins. You imagine surrender, and the thought scares you most of all. At some point, you realize dawn is close. The air shifts, lighter somehow, and faint grayness leaks through the arrow slit. You count your breaths, each one a fragile treasure. 20, 30, 40, each a reminder that you are still here, not yet gone. And when the door finally creaks open, boots thudding toward you, you flinch but do not rise. You are too cold, too weak, too aware. The guard looks at you with an expression unreadable pity, contempt, boredom. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. The sound of the key in the lock tells you enough. The night has given you no rest, only an endless rehearsal of death. And as the chain is lifted from your ankle, you realize that the cell itself has already done half the executioner's work. The night after an execution always carries a different kind of weight. Whether you were the one dragged away or the one left behind, the dungeon itself seems altered, its air thicker, its silence deeper. Tonight you are still here, but the shadow of what you witnessed or narrowly escaped clings to your skin. The cold presses harder, and you wonder whether fear itself makes you feel colder than usual. Reports from medieval chronicles often describe disease spreading like wildfire in these places. Captives weakened by frostbite, malnutrition, and untreated wounds quickly succumbed to fevers. Physicians rarely entered prisons. Healers considered them breeding grounds of contagion. One English monk wrote that to step inside a jail was to inhale death with every breath. You cough into your sleeve and wonder if he was exaggerating, but the burning in your chest suggests otherwise. There is a grim little story from an Italian source about a physician bribed to examine prisoners during winter. He declared them beyond help, but not before he pocketed payment from each man. Weeks later, he was found dead himself, struck by the same fever he had mocked. The tale is told with a touch of irony, as if to suggest that the dungeon's curse spares no arrogance. You think of him now and almost smile, though your lips crack from the cold. Specialists remain divided on how deliberate this neglect was. Some argue that authorities genuinely feared infection and avoided close contact. Others believe withholding care was purposeful, another layer of punishment in a system designed not to kill outright, but to grind men down slowly. Evidence is thin, but you don't need scrolls to confirm the truth. You can see it in the faces around you. The man to your left has sores on his ankles where shackles have rubbed raw flesh. He winces whenever he shifts, but no one tends to him. Another further down hacks endlessly, his cough wet, his body trembling with fever. The straw around him is damp with sweat. No one moves to help. To touch him might mean catching the same affliction. In this place, compassion is a luxury few can afford. You pull your own rags tighter, but the chill still seeps into your bones. Your fingers ache, stiff and red, nails darkened from bruises. You try rubbing them, blowing on them, but nothing staves off the numbness. Somewhere deep inside, a part of you knows that the line between cold and fever is thin. One slip, one long night without shivering, and you might cross it. The stench is worse tonight. Illness has its own odor, sour, metallic, heavy. It mixes with the rot already steeped into the walls until the air feels poisonous. You turn your face away, but the smell follows, thick as fog. You wonder if breath itself carries contagion. You wonder if, by morning, you'll be coughing too. Modern historians debate mortality rates of such environments. Some suggest most captives lasted weeks before illness claimed them. Others insist survival often stretched into years if luck or bribery brought small comforts. The statistics are blurred by time, but in your body, there is no ambiguity. The ache, the cough, the endless cold, they tell you plainly how fragile the line of life has become. You think of remedies you once knew: hot broth, clean bandages, herbs steeped in water. You imagine them vividly: the scent of rosemary, the heat of thyme. You picture hands wrapping you in linen, a fire blazing at your feet. These fantasies bring fleeting comfort, but they also sharpen the despair. Nothing of that kind exists here. You could cry for a healer, but no one would come. A prisoner beside you mutters a prayer to Saint Roche, patron against plague. His voice is weak, each word cracked, but he repeats it stubbornly, over and over. You listen, letting the rhythm of his plea soothe your own mind. Perhaps prayer works, perhaps it doesn't, but in the absence of medicine, repetition itself becomes a form of treatment. You close your eyes, but the sounds of illness refuse to let you rest. Coughs rattle, breaths wheeze, chains scrape, as bodies twist in discomfort. Each noise carries the weight of mortality. You shift restlessly, knowing that sleep might never come in such a symphony of sickness. At some point in the night, the man with the fever falls silent. The stillness around him is deafening. You don't need to check, you can feel it in the air. Another body for the guards to drag away in the morning. Another soul swallowed by the dungeon without ceremony. And lying there, staring into the dark, you realize how little separates you from him. Just a few degrees of warmth. Just a few breaths not yet ragged. Just one night survived, instead of surrendered. The knowledge is as heavy as the chains at your ankles. You whisper to yourself, just endure, just one more night. But deep inside, you know that in this place, survival is not measured by strength or courage. It is measured by luck, by the whim of illness, by the stubborn will of a body to keep trembling against the cold. And tonight, that trembling feels dangerously faint. The cell door groans open again, and this time the guards shove in a figure so small you think at first it must be a bundle of rags. Only when the shape shifts and a thin whimper escapes do you realize it's a child. The boy stumbles forward, barefoot, no more than 12, maybe younger. His eyes are wide, darting around the shadows, and you see the raw red of his feet against the frozen stone. The door slams before he can turn back, and the sound echoes like a verdict. Chroniclers from London's Newgate and Paris's Châtelet both mention children among the imprisoned. Some were held for theft, a loaf of bread, a chicken, a scrap of cloth. Others were simply the sons or daughters of debtors, locked in alongside parents who couldn't pay what they owed. In many records, there is no distinction between the old and the young. The cell absorbed them all. Tonight you see that reality embodied in the shivering boy hugging his knees. One odd tale survives in the municipal accounts of Lübeck, where a jailer noted that children sometimes became playthings for the guards. They would toss scraps to them as if feeding dogs, laughing to watch the little hands scramble across the filthy straw. You glance at the boy now and can almost hear that cruel laughter behind the door. Modern researchers argue over whether such imprisonment was common or rare. Some claim children were often spared the worst conditions, held separately or released to relatives. Others insist overcrowding forced everyone together, regardless of age. The debate matters little to you as you watch the boy shudder in the same straw you sleep on, lice already crawling toward his bare skin. He curls against the wall, tucking his face into his arms. You feel the instinct to reach out, to share your blanket scrap, but hesitation claws at you. Resources here are survival. 1 inch less of cloth, one shred less of warmth, could tip you closer to death. Yet when he coughs a dry, fragile sound, you find yourself sliding the edge of your rag toward him. He takes it silently, eyes wide, gratitude shining even through the grime. The cell feels different now. His presence magnifies the cruelty of every draught, every drip of water. You've grown numb to your own suffering, but seeing it mirrored in a child makes each misery fresh. When a rat scurries across the floor, he gasps, shrinking back. You want to tell him not to fear, that the creatures are companions as much as tormentors, but the words feel hollow. The noises of the night swell again, men groaning, chains clinking, guards shouting in the distance. The boy trembles with each sound, eyes darting to the door as if escape might still come. You remember your own first night, the weight of realization pressing like stone on your chest. For him, that weight is multiplied by fear too young to understand. Some scholars suggest that the presence of children in cells hardened adults, making them even more desperate, even more feral. Others believe it softened them, sparking forgotten instincts of care. Tonight, you sense both. Some prisoners scowl at the boy, muttering curses that another mouth now shares their meager rations. Others shift closer, offering quiet murmurs of comfort. In the dungeon, compassion and cruelty often sleep side by side. You close your eyes, but the boy's whimpering keeps you awake. It is a sound unlike the moans of grown men, thinner, sharper, cutting through the stone. You press your hands to your ears, but still it reaches you, until at last exhaustion drags both of you into a shallow slumber. Dreams come strange and heavy. You see the boy walking barefoot across snow, rats trailing him like shadows. He carries a loaf of bread too large for his arms, and every step sinks deeper into the frost. You try to follow, but chains drag you down, and he vanishes into the dark. You wake with your heart pounding, unsure if you've dreamed his future or your guilt. By dawn, he is still curled beside you, smaller even than he seemed at first. His breath fogs faintly in the air, proof he has survived the night. Relief washes through you, though you know the days ahead will gnaw at him as cruelly as they gnaw at everyone else. And as you watch him stir awake, rubbing his eyes with tiny fists, you realize the dungeon is not only a prison of bodies, it is a prison of innocence, swallowing even those who barely had the chance to live free. That knowledge chills you deeper than stone ever could. The boy's breathing steadies beside you, But another figure shuffles into the cell that same day, a man whose accent immediately marks him as foreign. His words stumble awkwardly through the local tongue, and when he curses, the syllables twist differently in his mouth. He wraps his arms around himself and mutters in a language you can't follow, though the tone is unmistakable. He is cold, and he is furious. Medieval prisons did not discriminate by nationality. Sieges produced captives from far-off lands, and merchants who quarreled with guilds or lords often found themselves locked up far from home. Documents from English ports list Italians, Flemings, and Spaniards in cells beside locals. Some accounts even mention Moors and Eastern traders taken during raids. These men endured not only the misery of the dungeon but the added cruelty of being strangers in a climate their bodies weren't built to withstand. One unusual anecdote survives from a French chronicle. A Saracen captive begged guards for straw not to sleep on but to burn, unable to believe that men could survive nights without fire. He allegedly wasted away within weeks, his system collapsing in the northern frost. You glance at the shivering man now and wonder if his fate will be similar. Scholars remain divided about how foreign prisoners were treated. Some argue they were afforded slight leniency, viewed as valuable for ransom or diplomacy. Others insist they suffered worse, despised as outsiders with no kin nearby to bring bribes or food. The truth is murky, but tonight you see only one fact. The man is alone in a way even you have never felt. He mutters to himself, stamping his feet, trying to stir warmth into his limbs. His cloak is thin, more suited for milder weather. You hear his teeth clatter, and he pulls his knees tight against his chest, eyes scanning the shadows with suspicion. Every sound, the cough of another prisoner, the rattle of chains, the squeak of a rat seems to startle him. You imagine the warmth of his homeland, the familiarity of his own language, and feel a pang of pity. The child stirs beside you, watching with wide eyes. The foreigner notices, forces a weak smile, and mutters something soothing. The boy doesn't understand the words, but tone transcends language. He leans back against you, reassured for a moment by the presence of another human voice. In this cell, comfort sometimes speaks without words. The night drags, and you listen to the man's voice weaving in and out of your understanding. Some phrases you recognize names of saints, pleas for warmth, but others are strange syllables that roll like water. They carry you into a half-dreaming state, the foreign tongue becoming a lullaby. Yet the man's tone shifts suddenly, sharp with anger, and you open your eyes to see him kicking at the straw in frustration. He gestures wildly, pointing at the dripping wall, at the chains, at the rats, as though ranting to invisible judges. You realize he is railing against the absurdity of it all, and even though you don't understand, you feel the rage burning through his words. Later he falls silent, shivering so violently you fear he'll collapse. Without thinking, you nudge your scrap of blanket toward him. He hesitates, then takes a corner, clutching it to his chest. You both pretend not to notice, but the gesture bridges a gap language cannot. For a few hours you are not locals or foreigners, captors or captives. You are just two bodies fighting the same cold. Modern researchers speculate that such shared suffering forged fleeting bonds between strangers. Letters from knights held overseas mention comradeship with fellow captives, despite differences in speech and faith. Others describe hostility, even violence, when food grew scarce. The balance between kinship and rivalry often shifted with every ration, every degree of frost. As dawn approaches, you realize the foreigner has finally fallen asleep. His breathing is rough but steady. You watch him in the dim light, the sharp angles of his face softened by exhaustion. Perhaps tomorrow he will wake, still cursing in his own tongue, still stamping for warmth. Perhaps he will not wake at all. Either way, tonight he has shared the same blanket, the same misery, the same fragile humanity. You lean back against the wall, eyes half closed, and the thought settles heavy in your mind. Captivity erases borders. Here, language and homeland mean little. Cold, hunger, and despair are fluent in every tongue. The foreigner's mutterings linger in your ears even after he dozes off, but the dungeon isn't finished with you yet. Tonight, new noises slither through the corridors, sounds that don't belong to song or prayer, or even the rattling of chains. They are sharper, shorter, punctuated by cries that cut the silence like knives. You recognize them slowly, with dread settling in your stomach. Someone, somewhere nearby, is being tortured. Written accounts of castles and jails often describe chambers dedicated not to sleeping but to breaking. These rooms were never far from the cells, because the suffering of the tortured was meant to be heard. Chroniclers of the Tower of London note that moans and screams served as warnings, drifting down corridors to remind prisoners what disobedience cost. Tonight, that warning is loud. A disturbing anecdote comes from a 14th century Nuremberg record. Prisoners claimed they could tell which device was being used by the pitch of the screams. The rack produced long, stretched howls. The whip drew shorter cries. The strappado ended in abrupt silence. You hear the echoes now and shudder, realizing you are involuntarily trying to make the same guesses. Experts remain uncertain whether torture was as frequent as legend claims. Some argue the devices were more symbolic, used sparingly to inspire fear. Others insist it was routine, woven into the fabric of interrogation. The debate continues, but your body doesn't care for statistics. The sounds you hear are real enough, and each one feels like a blade pressed against your own skin. The child beside you stirs, covering his ears with tiny hands. The foreigner mutters angrily, pacing the length his chain allows, as though he could shout the cries away. You sit frozen, caught between horror and a strange relief. At least tonight, the screams belong to someone else. The smell seems sharper, too. Smoke, perhaps, or burning oil drifts faintly through the cracks. You gag as it mingles with the mildew. It conjures images you'd rather not imagine: flesh too close to flame, cloth smouldering in torchlight. You press the rag of blanket to your face, but it does little to block the stench. The screams rise again, higher, sharper, before cutting off suddenly. The silence that follows is worse than the noise. You hold your breath, waiting for the next cry, but none comes. Instead, footsteps echo in the corridor, heavy and slow, as if dragging something behind. Chains clink, a door slams, and then the dungeon exhales into quiet once more. You glance at the boy. His eyes are wide, glistening with fear. You whisper something soft, though you aren't sure what: comfort, perhaps, or just noise to fill the silence. He leans closer, burying his face in your shoulder. The warmth of his body against yours feels fragile, a reminder of innocence trembling in the darkest place. Some historians argue that hearing torture without seeing it could be more damaging than witnessing it directly. The imagination, after all, fills in gaps with horrors more vivid than reality. Others suggest the opposite, that seeing was worse, leaving scars that sound alone could not match. You wonder which is true as your mind replays the cries in endless loops. The foreigner eventually begins to sing softly in his own tongue. The words mean nothing to you, but the tone steadies the air. The boy relaxes against your side, his breathing slowing. The song rises and falls like waves, fighting the memory of screams with melody. You close your eyes, letting the sound carry you into a half-sleep. But even dreams are tainted. You see corridors lined with torches, figures bent under instruments of iron, shadows stretching endlessly. You hear the cries again, mixed now with laughter, the grotesque blend of torment and amusement. You wake with sweat on your brow, shivering harder than before. The night continues, long and merciless. Each creak of wood, each drip of water seems amplified. You wait for another scream, another reminder, but none comes. The silence becomes its own kind of torture, pressing into your chest like stone. By dawn, you are exhausted, your body weak, your mind frayed. The boy stirs, the foreigner stretches stiffly, and all of you pretend not to remember the cries that haunted the night. But you do remember. You always will. And the cruelest truth settles heavy. In a dungeon like this, even when pain belongs to someone else, you share it. The stone carries every echo, and the cold makes sure no suffering is ever truly private. The echoes of torture still linger in your skull, but tonight the dungeon brings a different kind of lesson. When the iron door creaks open and another captive is shoved inside, you notice instantly that she is not like the others. Her skirt, though torn, still clings around her legs. A shawl is wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She is a woman, and in this place that detail changes everything. Historical records confirm that women, though fewer in number, did end up in medieval prisons. Some were accused of theft or witchcraft, others of heresy, and many simply inherited the debts of fathers or husbands. A 14th century record from York lists a laundress jailed for stealing cloth she was never paid to wash. In Paris, women accused of gossiping too boldly about officials could find themselves thrown into dank cells for weeks. The presence of women didn't soften the dungeon. It often sharpened its cruelty. A curious account from Lubeck describes women making use of their clothing to survive the cold. Skirts became blankets, shawls doubled as cushions, and long hair was braided thick to keep the neck warm. You watched the woman in your cell settle into her corner, pulling her shawl tight, arranging her skirt over her legs as if building a fortress of fabric against the frost. Researchers remain divided on whether female prisoners received slightly better treatment. Some suggest guards allowed them a bit more cloth, pitying their fragility. Others argue the opposite, that women were mocked more harshly, their discomfort considered entertaining. The conflicting evidence mirrors what you feel now, uncertain whether her presence will draw mercy or cruelty from those who hold the keys. The boy watches her with wide eyes, as though surprised to see softness in such a place. The foreigner mutters a greeting in his broken mix of tongues. She nods but says nothing, curling deeper into her shawl. Silence is its own defense here. The night stretches on, and you notice her shifting often, trying to fold her skirts beneath her to ward off the cold of the floor. Each movement sends the faintest whisper of fabric across stone, a sound so out of place in this dungeon that it almost feels like music. She adjusts, tucks, folds again. It's a rhythm you recognize. Improvisation, desperation, survival. The smell of mildew still clings, the rats still scurry, but something about the presence of her shawl and skirts shifts the air. You see that clothing here is more than modesty, it is weaponry against the elements. You recall how women in chronicles sometimes tore strips from their own garments to wrap children's feet, or braided layers to make crude ropes. Fabric became lifeline, even when thin and ragged. At some point, she notices the boy shivering violently. Without hesitation, she pulls a corner of her shawl over his shoulders. He leans against her gratefully, and for the first time in weeks, you see something rare, tenderness blooming in the dark. The gesture stings you, not because it hurts, but because it reminds you how easily compassion can survive, even here. Some modern scholars suggest that women's presence in prisons introduced fragile networks of care, moments of gentleness in otherwise brutal environments. Others argue such gestures were fleeting, swallowed quickly by the dungeon's hunger. Looking at the boy resting beneath her shawl, you realize both might be true. Compassion here is temporary, but its spark burns brighter precisely because it is rare. The foreigner, restless, begins humming again in his strange language. This time the woman joins softly, her voice low but steady, weaving an unfamiliar harmony. You lie back against the wall, listening. The duet drifts through the straw, carrying you to a place where cold feels distant. For a few minutes, the cell is less a dungeon and more a gathering of survivors, bound not by chains but by the fragile threads of song and cloth. Yet comfort never lasts here. A guard stomps past, shouts something crude through the bars, and the woman stiffens, pulling her shawl closer. You see the fear etched in her face. Her clothing may shield her from the cold, but not from the gaze of men who see her as weaker prey. The tension lingers long after his boots fade into silence. Sleep comes late. You drift into it with the sound of fabric rustling and voices humming. Your dreams twist, blending shawls into banners, skirts into tents, the woman's voice into the chanting of monks. You wake with straw clinging to your skin, but also with a faint warmth in your chest that wasn't there before. By dawn, the woman still sits upright, her shawl draped over the boy like wings. She hasn't slept much, her eyes are heavy, her back stiff, but she has endured. In this dungeon, endurance is triumph. And tonight, her skirt and shawl have carried not only herself, but others through the cold. You realize then that survival isn't always about strength or rage. Sometimes, it is about fabric pulled tight, about shawls shared, about tenderness refusing to vanish even in the foulest corners of stone. The woman's shawl still drapes over the boy when the next prisoner arrives. This one is different again, not ragged or feral, but stiff-backed, shoulders squared, his bearing marked by pride, even in chains. His cloak is patched but once fine, his hands ink-stained rather than calloused. A political prisoner, you realize, the kind captured not for theft or hunger but for words, allegiance, or schemes. He lowers himself onto the straw with a sigh, already fumbling for a scrap of parchment hidden in his sleeve. Surviving chronicles tell us that political detainees were often treated with ambivalence. Too valuable to kill outright, too dangerous to release, they lingered in cells for years. Some wrote poetry, some copied scripture, some kept diaries smuggled out on scraps of cloth or carved into the very walls. In France, a noble accused of treason etched entire verses into limestone, his poem still visible centuries later. You watch this man now, and see the same instinct, his fingers itch for expression even as frost creeps through the cell. A strange anecdote from Scotland tells of a baron who, denied ink, mixed soot with his own saliva to write letters on the inside of his cloak. The guards mocked him for madness, but those markings were later found to hold coded plans. You imagine tonight's companion doing the same, his determination refusing to freeze. Researchers remain split over whether such writings were tolerated. Some evidence suggests jailers ignored it, considering poetry harmless. Others argue scribbling could be dangerous, a means of passing secret messages, and punishable by harsher chains. The uncertainty mirrors the quiet tension in your cell as the man scratches invisible lines on his sleeve, daring anyone to stop him. The boy stares curiously. The woman watches with suspicion. The foreigner hums low as always. You lie back and listen as the man begins reciting under his breath. His voice is steady, melodic, even elegant. The words, though half mumbled, paint pictures of sunlight spilling over battlements, of rivers thawing in spring, of freedom sketched like a dream. His tone is so calm it almost feels mocking, as though he refuses to acknowledge the cold gnawing at his bones. The noise of the dungeon changes around him. Moans, coughs, and rattling chains seem to soften beneath his verses. Even the rats pause, whiskers twitching as if listening. Poetry becomes insulation, wrapping the cell in rhythm no frost can breach. For a few minutes, you are not in stone but in memory, not in filth but in imagination. And yet, the irony bites deep. Here is a man who once debated lords or rallied allies, now scribbling into cloth like a schoolboy hiding notes. You wonder whether he feels pride or humiliation. His words float with dignity, but his eyes betray fatigue. The ink stains on his hands blur into dirt. His cloak clings with mildew. He clutches beauty, but the dungeon claws harder. Historians argue whether such verses were acts of rebellion or of survival. Some see them as quiet defiance, words resisting silence. Others interpret them as coping mechanisms, desperate attempts to make meaning from misery. Both seem true as you watch him. The verses are not just poetry, they are armor against the frost. The boy edges closer, listening with fascination. The woman frowns, torn between admiration and bitterness. The foreigner mutters in his tongue, perhaps translating the rhythm into his own cadence. You close your eyes and let the words settle into your chest, heavy and soothing, until they become part of your heartbeat. The smell of rot and mildew doesn't vanish, but for once it competes with the scent of memory, ink, parchment, wax, libraries untouched by frost. The poet conjures places that feel impossibly far away, yet alive in his voice. You imagine yourself standing on grassy hills, wind warm, chains gone, and for a moment you believe it. But reality never lets you linger. The guard stomps past, hears the man murmuring, and bangs on the bars. "Shut your mouth," he barks. The poet falls silent instantly, eyes lowered. Yet his lips keep moving in tiny whispers. The guard leaves, muttering curses, and the cell returns to its rhythm. You realize then that poetry is more dangerous than it looks. Words can unsettle jailers more than rattling chains. The hours creep on. You drift between sleep and waking, the man's recitations threading through your dreams. He speaks of justice, of betrayal, of frost that cannot last forever. His voice becomes both lullaby and alarm, reminding you that even here, thought is not shackled. By dawn, the man has fallen quiet, slumped against the wall, parchment scrap clenched in his hand. His verses remain unfinished, his breath fogging faintly in the air. Yet the memory of them lingers, warming you in ways straw and rags never could. You realize then that survival in this dungeon is not only about warmth or food, it is about holding on to something the frost cannot freeze. A verse, a thought, a whisper of defiance carved into stone. The poet's whispers linger long after dawn fades, but the next night brings a different kind of murmur. It starts faintly, almost lost under the rattling of chains and the coughing of the sick. A low hum, repeated phrases, words stitched together in rhythm. At first you think it's another prisoner rambling into madness, but then you recognize the pattern: prayer. Medieval records often mention the persistence of faith inside prisons. Even when chains bit into ankles and frost turned straw brittle, men and women whispered psalms or muttered rosaries. A 14th century account from Avignon describes heretics praying all night, their voices echoing so steadily that guards swore it haunted their dreams. Tonight you hear the same cadence, a fragile rope thrown against despair. There's an odd story from Florence about a woman jailed for sorcery who recited the same psalm every evening until the other prisoners, annoyed at first, eventually joined in. What began as complaint turned into ritual, and the whole cell supposedly fell asleep each night to the same refrain. You wonder whether the voice in your own darkness might do the same, weaving strangers into unwilling congregation. As for whether faith truly eased suffering, scholars remain divided. Some argue prayer was a psychological balm, giving prisoners rhythm and purpose when nothing else remained. Others insist it sharpened torment, reminding captives of heaven's warmth while their bodies froze on stone. The debate cannot be settled from parchment alone, but lying here, listening to the hum, you feel both sides at once. The woman who entered days before begins to join in, her voice soft but steady. The boy follows, stammering through words he half remembers. Even the foreigner hums along, his accent bending the syllables yet blending into the harmony. You remain silent at first, but soon the rhythm draws you in. The prayer becomes less about faith and more about survival, its repetition warming your chest like a fire you can't see. The smell of mildew still clings, rats still skitter, the cold still gnaws, but for a few minutes those miseries dim under the weight of chant. The dungeon becomes a chapel without light, a choir bound in iron. You close your eyes and let the vibration carry you, as though the stone itself is humming back. The guards notice. One bangs on the bars, shouting for silence. The voices falter but do not stop. The guard curses, throws a bucket of water into the straw, and storms off. You sit drenched, teeth chattering, but the chant rises again, stubborn as frost. You realize then that prayer here is not only faith, it is rebellion. The hours creep forward. Sometimes the chant fades into whispers, sometimes it swells louder, but it never vanishes. Even when exhaustion silences throats, lips continue to move. You watch the poet trace verses on his sleeve, the woman murmur into the boy's ear, the foreigner hum into the cold. The rhythm becomes your heartbeat, your breath, the fragile net that keeps despair from crushing you. Modern researchers suggest such rituals may have helped prisoners mark time, dividing endless nights into patterns of sound. Others claim it created illusions of community, blurring the loneliness. Perhaps both are true. All you know is that without the chant, the night would feel unbearable. With it, the misery becomes almost shareable, softened by repetition. Sleep arrives gently, surprising you. You dream of churches you once passed, sunlight streaming through colored glass, warmth pooling on stone floors. You dream of bells tolling, not for death but for morning prayer. You wake to none of it, only darkness, straw, and frost, but the memory clings like another blanket. By dawn, the chant has faded into silence, replaced by snores and coughs, yet the air feels changed. The dungeon still reeks, still freezes, still groans, but something invisible lingers. A thread of defiance, a promise that even in darkness, voices will not be silenced. You stretch your stiff limbs, joints cracking, and realize the cruel paradox. Prayer does not warm your body, but it warms your will. And in a place where chains gnaw and rats feast, sometimes the will to endure is the only warmth that matters. The day passes in silence, broken only by groans and coughs, until night returns with its claws of frost. You brace for another sleepless stretch when the guard appears again, this time carrying something that clinks softly. He tosses it through the bars, and the bundle lands in the straw with a thud. You crawl forward, eyes narrowing, and realize what it is. A blanket. Not given freely, though the guard lingers, palm open, waiting. Prison accounts from across Europe often mention this unspoken system. Official rations rarely included bedding or firewood, but guards would sell scraps to those who could pay. A few coins, a promise of labor after release, or even jewelry stripped from captives became the currency of warmth. In London's jails, the practice was so common it earned a nickname, buying the night. You stare at the guard's hand and know the price is always higher than coin alone. One odd story from a Flemish record tells of a prisoner who bartered away his shoes in exchange for a sheepskin. The skin stank so badly it nearly suffocated him, but he clung to it until release. He walked barefoot through snow, yet swore he survived only because of that foul hide. You glance at the ragged blanket now and wonder if its stink will become your salvation too. Historians disagree about whether these exchanges were tolerated or condemned. Some argue the system was unofficially encouraged, padding the wages of underpaid keepers. Others claim it was corruption, forbidden but unavoidable in practice. Either way, tonight you face the same truth every captive before you faced. If you want warmth, you must pay. The poet digs into his sleeve and produces a silver clasp, once part of his cloak. He presses it into the guard's palm, and the blanket is shoved through the bars. The guard smirks, mutters something about comfort for the clever, and leaves. You unfold the cloth, it is coarse, heavy, and reeks of damp wool. But compared to the rags you've clutched before, it feels like luxury. The woman eyes it with longing, the boy with desperation, the foreigner with suspicion. You know instantly the blanket is not just a tool for warmth, but a spark of tension. In this cell, every scrap of comfort becomes contested ground. You spread it over your knees, then hesitate. The others watch silently, waiting. At last, you tug the edges wide, inviting them beneath. One by one, they shift closer, until the four of you huddle under its weight. The change is immediate. The warmth is faint, but real. Your shoulders brush, your breath mingles, and for the first time in weeks, the air beneath the cloth feels almost safe. The boy curls against your side, sighing softly. The woman adjusts her shawl to patch the gaps. The foreigner mutters in his tongue, but his grip on the edge tightens. The dungeon is still cold, still foul, still heavy with the stink of mildew, but beneath the blanket, you imagine a hearth. You imagine a cottage where families gather by firelight, sharing food and stories. The illusion lingers just long enough to carry you towards sleep. Yet, even as you drift, you know the blanket is no blessing without cost. The poet has paid dearly, and tomorrow the guard will expect more. Perhaps coins, perhaps secrets, perhaps obedience. Comfort is never free in these walls. It is another chain, softer but binding all the same. Researchers suggest that such transactions blurred the line between punishment and survival. Guards profited from misery, and prisoners learned to bargain with scraps of dignity. Some accounts describe men selling even their blood for wine or cloth. Others hint at darker bargains, left unrecorded but whispered in chronicles. The truth is grimly simple. Warmth could always be bought, but never without debt. You curl deeper into the blanket, feeling its coarse fibers itch against your skin. You know tomorrow it may be taken, or another price demanded. But tonight, it shields you. Tonight, you share warmth with strangers who have become reluctant companions. The boy sleeps first, breathing evenly. The woman follows, her shawl rising and falling. The foreigner mutters until his voice fades. The poet stares upward, lips moving silently, perhaps reciting another verse. You watch him until your own eyes close, the blanket pulling you toward dreams warmer than reality. By dawn, frost clings to the walls again, but your limbs are less stiff than usual. You realize you've survived the night with more rest than you thought possible. The blanket lies heavy across all of you, proof of a bargain struck in desperation. And as the guard returns, jangling keys, you understand the lesson carved into this night. In a dungeon, comfort is currency, and every scrap of warmth carries a price far colder than the stone floor itself. The coarse blanket lingers through the day like a guilty secret. By nightfall it has already soaked up the stink of mildew and sweat, yet none of you dare let go of it. When the torches are doused and the corridor sinks into blackness, you all shift closer, trying to fold yourselves into the smallest space possible. The fabric scratches against your neck, stiff with grime, but still you clutch it, because tonight, as every night, the cold comes hunting. There is a cruel rhythm to these hours. You fall into half sleep, your body jerking awake each time numbness creeps too far into your limbs. You toss, you turn, you chase warmth as if it were prey. The boy wriggles constantly, first pressing into your ribs, then shifting away, then returning again like a tide. The woman sighs each time the shawl slips from her shoulders, tugging it back into place. The foreigner mutters in his sleep, fists clenching the edge of the blanket as if it might run off without him. You, too, keep searching one more twist, one more curl, anything to find comfort. Chroniclers described this restless ballet with bitter precision. In one English jail, a clerk wrote that prisoners rolled like fish on a griddle, never still, ever chasing the corner of warmth that fled from them. You understand the image perfectly. No position lasts more than a few breaths before pain or chill forces another shift. A curious anecdote from a Venetian record tells of captives who devised a strange strategy. They took turns lying flat, while the others piled on top, bodies stacked like logs to trap heat. The man on the bottom endured agony, pressed against stone, but when his shift ended, he became the warmer layer above. You imagine your own group attempting the same, and the thought is so absurd you almost laugh aloud. Scholars continue to disagree on whether such contortions were conscious strategies or simply instinct. Some argue prisoners planned rotations carefully, rationing their bodies like supplies. Others suggest the movements were unconscious, desperate twitching in the fight against frost. Whatever the case, tonight your body proves the theory true: you cannot stay still. Not for long. The straw beneath you crunches each time you move, brittle and sharp. Fleas stir, biting your ankles as if scolding you for disturbing them. You slap at them, mutter curses, then curl tighter, knees pressed against your chest. Your chain scrapes the floor, the sound echoing like a bell in the hollow cell. Each clang reminds you that even your shifting has limits. The blanket slides again. You tug it up, but it drags across the foreigner's back. He grumbles in his tongue, pulling the fabric closer to himself. You pull back. For a heartbeat, the two of you glare through the dark, each clutching at coarse wool as though it were treasure. Then the boy whimpers, shivering, and shame forces you both to loosen your grip. The blanket settles crooked across all of you, patchwork coverage against an endless cold. The dungeon amplifies every sound of this struggle. Chains clinking, straw rustling, cloth tearing slightly at the seams. It becomes a rhythm, almost musical, yet mocking. You think of the monk's chants you once heard through walls, and realize that this shifting, this scratching, is your own midnight hymn. Modern researchers note that constant movement in such conditions was inevitable, both a sign of survival and of torment. Bodies too weak to stir often froze first, stillness becoming a death sentence. Others, restless enough to keep wriggling, endured longer. You feel grim comfort in that thought. Your ceaseless tossing means your body hasn't surrendered. Not yet. The hours crawl. You search for heat in shoulders, in elbows, even in breath fogging into your face. You press your nose against the boy's hair, inhaling his warmth despite the dirt. You tuck your feet beneath the woman's skirt edge, apologizing under your breath. She doesn't answer, but she doesn't move away either. The foreigner exhales heavily, shifting closer too. For a moment, all of you overlap like a puzzle of limbs, the blanket sagging above, straw crunching below. Still, comfort never lasts. A draft snakes through the arrow slit, cruel and precise, as though the stone itself conspires to strip away your meager gains. The fabric flutters, the warmth scatters, and once again the dance begins, rolling, tucking, clutching. You curse softly, teeth chattering, body aching from the endless cycle. An especially cruel detail in Chronicles notes that some prisoners hallucinated warmth after long nights of shifting. They swore the stone itself grew hot, only to collapse when numbness claimed their limbs. You wonder whether your own tingling fingers are heat or its absence. You slap them until pain returns, relieved by the sting. At last, exhaustion dulls your movements. You no longer chase warmth actively. Instead, you surrender to the rhythm, shifting only when agony forces you. Your body learns the dungeon's cruel game, not how to win, but how to last one more hour. By dawn, the blanket is damp with sweat, the straw scattered, the fleas fat. You sit up slowly, every joint stiff, every muscle sore, yet you are alive. And in this dungeon, that is the only measure that matters. You realize then the lesson etched into your restless night. Survival here is not found in stillness. It is carved out of motion, of twitching and clutching, of chasing warmth that never stays. You do not sleep so much as wrestle with the cold until daylight finds you. The night feels longer than usual, stretched thin like wax, melting too slowly. You already know what's coming, because you've felt it before. The fever, dream hours when your body hovers between sleep and waking, when the dungeon seems to blur at its edges. The cold numbs your limbs, but your mind refuses to rest. You drift in and out, seeing things that may or may not be real. Chroniclers wrote often about the strange visions prisoners experienced. Some described angels with wings of frost who hovered above their straw beds. Others claimed to hear bells tolling in empty corridors, or to see torches flicker where none burned. In London's Newgate, a man swore he saw his dead wife kneeling by his chain, only for her to vanish when he reached out. Tonight, you realize why such tales filled the margins of records. The dungeon is fertile soil for hallucination. A particularly odd anecdote from Lubeck tells of a debtor who insisted rats spoke to him, offering bargains in exchange for crumbs. His fellow prisoners laughed at first, but when he died days later, they swore they still heard squeaks forming words. You hear the scurry of rats now and wonder uneasily whether their squeaks shape syllables you're too tired to recognize. Specialists remain divided on how to interpret these visions. Some argue they were divine revelations, proof that even stone walls couldn't block heaven. Others see them as symptoms of starvation, illness, and exhaustion. Perhaps both are true, and perhaps in the dungeon the line between miracle and madness doesn't matter. You close your eyes and images bloom. A meadow of green grass, sunlight warming your skin, a loaf of bread fresh from the oven. You reach for it, but the warmth burns your fingers, and suddenly the bread becomes a torch, smoke curling into your nostrils. You cough and jolt awake, realizing it's only the draught carrying the sour stink of mildew. The boy murmurs beside you, trapped in his own dream. His lips move, whispering names you can't catch. The woman strokes his hair with trembling fingers, her eyes half shut but still watchful. The foreigner mutters in his own tongue, his voice rising and falling like waves. The poet, ever restless, scratches lines onto stone with his chain, carving verses that blur into prayers. You watch them all and think, perhaps every prisoner survives by dreaming their own way out, even if only for an hour. The dungeon itself begins to feel alive. Drips echo like whispers. Shadows stretch into shapes that move when you don't. You blink hard, but the figures linger, faces etched into stone, eyes gleaming in torchlight that isn't there. You tell yourself it's fatigue, but the shiver in your spine suggests otherwise. Modern researchers suggest sleep deprivation in such conditions mirrored torture. Without steady rest, the mind eats itself, producing visions to fill the void. Yet some argue these hallucinations kept prisoners alive, giving them stories to cling to, even if they were lies. You consider this as you watch a shadow lean from the wall, only to dissolve when you shift your gaze. Does it matter if it's real, so long as it distracts you from cold? The night deepens. You drift again, and this time the dream feels more coherent. You stand in a grand hall, fire blazing in a hearth, tables spread with food. Yet the chains on your ankles remain, rattling against marble. Guests laugh, ignoring you, and when you shout, their faces melt into masks of rats. You jolt awake with a cry, startling the boy, who clutches your arm until he too slips back into uneasy sleep. The woman hums softly, a tune without words, perhaps to comfort the boy, perhaps to steady her own nerves. The sound pulls you back from panic, grounding you. You focus on her voice, letting it drown the shadows. Eventually your breathing steadies, though your mind still trembles on the edge of dream. Somewhere down the corridor, another prisoner shrieks in his sleep. His cry echoes like a blade cutting through the dark, then fades into whimpers. You realize you aren't the only one haunted tonight. The whole dungeon is an orchestra of nightmares, each man or woman conducting their own madness in the dark. By dawn, you feel drained, hollowed out by visions and half-dreams. Yet you are also oddly relieved. The hallucinations may torment, but they also prove you're still alive, still fighting. Death brings silence. Madness, at least, still makes noise. You stretch stiffly, scratching the marks of straw from your skin, and whisper to yourself, "Endure." Even if your mind cracks, even if shadows whisper, you must keep breathing. In this dungeon, The line between dream and waking may blur, but survival means walking it night after night. The fever dreams of the night before leave you weak, but tonight the dungeon offers a different trial. Silence. The voices that usually moan and chant have dwindled. The boy sleeps heavily. The woman breathes shallow under her shawl. The foreigner mutters only once before falling quiet, and even the poet is still. The corridor beyond is hushed. For a moment, you almost welcome it until the silence grows too complete. Chroniclers often remarked that silence in a jail could be more suffocating than noise. A clerk from Bruges wrote that, when the prisoners no longer groaned, it was as though death itself had entered to keep watch. In London, a keeper confessed. He preferred the racket of moans and clanking chains to the eerie quiet that sometimes settled after disease swept through. Tonight you understand what they meant. The absence of sound is its own torment. One unusual tale from a 15th century Castilian record tells of captives who deliberately sang bawdy songs just to banish the silence. They claimed that without noise they could feel madness creeping into their skulls like frost through a crack. You lie still, straining your ears, and wonder if you should hum, speak, anything to break the stillness before it swallows you. Historians remain uncertain whether silence in these prisons was imposed or accidental. Some argue guards enforced it, beating those who spoke after dark. Others suggest illness or despair simply dulled voices, leaving survivors alone with their thoughts. Both interpretations weigh on you as you stare at the ceiling, every heartbeat thudding louder than footsteps ever did. The smell remains, thick as always, mildew, rust, sweat, but tonight it feels amplified, as though without sound your nose notices more. You gag quietly, covering your face with the blanket scrap, but the stink seeps through. Even the rats are subdued, their usual scratching muffled to faint rustles. The silence seems to command everything. You shift in your straw, desperate for a distraction. The chain scrapes the floor with a jarring clang, and the sound startles you like a shout in a chapel. The boy stirs. The woman murmurs faintly, then both sink back into stillness. The echo fades quickly, leaving you lonelier than before. Modern researchers suggest sensory deprivation was one of the dungeon's cruelest weapons. Too much noise frayed nerves, but too little hollowed the mind, leaving prisoners lost in their own thoughts. Some wrote that they spoke aloud just to hear a voice, even if it was their own. You whisper now nonsense words, fragments of memory just to keep company with yourself. Your own voice sounds strange, fragile against the stone. You try again, louder, but the words dissolve into the damp. No one answers. You laugh softly at the absurdity, whispering to shadows, speaking to straw. The sound echoes once, then dies. The silence swallows it whole. Hours creep by like years. You count your breaths, losing track after 100. You count the drips of water, but the irregular rhythm drives you mad. You pinch your arm to feel something, to mark time, but the pain fades too quickly. Silence erases every measure of existence. Then, faintly, the poet stirs. His lips move, shaping words you cannot hear. Perhaps verses, perhaps prayers. You lean closer, straining, but no sound emerges. His voice is trapped inside him, gestures without noise. The sight chills you more than screams ever did. Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaks faintly, then shuts. The sound is so sharp in the stillness that it echoes for minutes. You cling to it desperately, savoring the reminder that the world hasn't ended, that guards still breathe, that life exists outside. But soon even that fades, leaving you wrapped in silence again. Your mind begins to invent noises. You hear footsteps that aren't there, whispers just beyond reach, bells tolling in the distance. Each time you jerk awake, ears ringing, but there is nothing. Only your own pulse, hammering louder than drums. Sleep comes at last, heavy and dreamless. You wake with stiff joints, uncertain whether minutes or hours passed. The silence remains, pressing down like a second blanket. By dawn, when the first real noises return, boots stomping, keys rattling, you almost cry with relief. You realize then that sound, however cruel, is proof of life. Noise means others still exist, even if they suffer. Silence, by contrast, feels like burial. And in this dungeon, burial often comes long before the grave. The silence of the previous night clings to your bones, but tonight the dungeon reminds you that noise and quiet are only two sides of the same torment. What changes now is not sound but time itself. You lie on the straw, chain heavy against your ankle, and realize you can no longer tell whether the moon has risen, whether the bell above ever rang, whether the grey that creeps through the slit is dawn or just mist. Hours dissolve, shapeless. Chroniclers left notes on this peculiar torture. Prisoners deprived of sunlight often lost their sense of time completely. One clerk in Cologne remarked that men begged not for food or water, but to be told what day it was. Another, from Florence, described debtors who swore they had been held for months, when in truth only weeks had passed. Time, in a dungeon, was both the easiest thing to lose and the hardest to endure. A strange anecdote survives from Prague. A merchant imprisoned for fraud claimed he measured days by counting the drips of water from the ceiling. He estimated thousands, scratched tallies into the wall. When freed, he discovered he had miscounted by seasons, convinced winter was still beginning though spring had already arrived. You think of him now, as you listen to the irregular drip in your own cell. 1, 2, 3. Then silence for long minutes before another falls. You abandon the count before madness takes hold. Historians are divided on whether this distortion was accidental or intentional. Some argue the architecture of castles naturally deprived prisoners of sunlight. Others suggest it was deliberate arrow slits designed not only to defend but to obscure time, ensuring no prisoner knew whether death approached at dawn or dusk. Both theories feel true as you lie there, blind to the hours. The boy shifts beside you, asking weakly if it is morning yet. The woman strokes his hair and answers, "Soon," though her eyes are as lost as yours. The foreigner mutters in his language, pointing upward as if guessing the stars beyond stone. The poet traces invisible lines on his sleeve, whispering of seasons and solstices. Everyone clings to their own illusion of time, each method a thread against chaos. You try to mark hours by your own body. Hunger, shivering, fatigue, but those betray you too. Hunger feels constant. Sleep arrives in fragments. Shivering never ends. You cannot measure what never changes. The dungeon has stolen clocks not only from stone but from your flesh. Modern researchers describe this state as temporal collapse. They suggest it breaks prisoners faster than chains, robbing them of a sense of progress. Without days or nights, suffering feels endless, impossible to measure or survive. Some argue this is the essence of punishment, not knowing when it ends. You feel the truth of that with every restless turn in straw. At one point, you swear you see a faint glow through the slit dawn, perhaps? You sit upright, heart pounding, but the light fades again, leaving only shadow. Was it moon, torch, or imagination? You slump back, furious at your own hope. Even light has become untrustworthy. The cellmates create rituals to anchor themselves. The poet recites verses at what he claims is evening. The woman hums softly before curling into her shawl, marking what she calls midnight. The boy counts to 100 before sleeping, then again when he wakes, calling it a day. None of these rituals are real, yet each carries the weight of survival. You begin to whisper your own marker. Every time you hear a rat squeak, you call it an hour. By this measure, you live through hundreds of hours in a single night. Dreams blur into waking. You dream of bells tolling, then wake to silence. You dream of sunrise, only to open your eyes to darkness. Your mind begins to question whether time exists at all, or if the dungeon is eternal. You whisper, "Endure," again and again, not to count but to remind yourself that even endless nights must eventually break. Finally, after what feels like years, boots thud above. A key rattles. The door opens. Dawn has come, though you cannot say how long you waited. Relief floods you, not because morning offers warmth, but because it proves time has not stopped entirely. The world still moves, even if you cannot see it. You realize then the cruel genius of the dungeon. It does not only chain your body, it chains your hours, your days, your seasons. It teaches you that suffering is not measured in minutes but in eternity. And tonight, eternity has been your cellmate. You have long since lost count of the days, but this night feels different. Not colder, not louder, just heavier, as though the stones themselves lean inward. You lie on your straw and sense that the dungeon has reached its final lesson. You know the drills by now. The restless shifting, the gnawing hunger, the whispers of poetry or prayer. Yet tonight, none of these bring distraction. The cold, the chains, the darkness, everything feels sharp, as if the walls are reminding you one last time of their power. Chroniclers often wrote that the worst part of imprisonment wasn't the torture, nor even the threat of death, but the exhaustion of enduring. One English debtor compared it to a winter that never yields to spring. A monk in Cologne described prisoners as souls frozen before their bodies die. You understand both lines perfectly now. What you endure isn't one night, but the endless repetition of nights, each identical, each devouring hope. An unusual story survives from a Swiss jail. One man claimed he grew fond of his straw bed after years underground, swearing it was softer than any feather mattress he'd known. When finally freed, he begged to keep a bundle of the filthy stalks. Whether the tale is true or not, it reveals the dungeon's final cruelty. You learn to mistake misery for comfort, chains for routine. You catch yourself tonight stroking the coarse blanket scrap as if it were velvet, and the thought unsettles you more than hunger ever could. Academics remain divided over what broke prisoners most, the physical torments or the creeping acceptance of them. Some argue frost and filth destroyed the body first, others that despair hollowed the mind long before. The disagreement hardly matters. You feel both truths. Your joints ache from the cold, but worse, you have started to believe this life is normal. That is the deepest wound. The boy stirs restlessly in his sleep, murmuring for his mother. The woman shifts her shawl to cover him. The foreigner hums faintly even while unconscious, as if his mind refuses silence. The poet scribbles lines on stone with his chain, half awake, half dreaming. They all cling to their rituals, but you see now that these are less about hope than habit. The dungeon teaches you to survive by repetition, but it also teaches you to forget what life felt like before. You curl tighter into the blanket scrap, listening to the dungeon's chorus one last time. The drip of water, the shuffle of rats, the rasp of breathing. The sounds blur together until they form a rhythm, the heartbeat of the prison itself. You wonder if, centuries from now, someone will stand in this chamber and still feel the echo of that rhythm, still sense the